well, she doesn't necessarily have the respect that she needs. So what role would the opposition play in any sort of transition? And what will that mean for the U.S. as well? All of these questions remain unanswered.
And so in terms of political reaction to what has happened in the United States, just give us an idea of what people have been saying, because there's been some pretty strong opposition from the Democrats.
Yeah, perhaps unsurprisingly, the reaction has been largely partisan. We've seen a number of Republican members of Congress saying Nicolás Maduro is an illegitimate leader. He is one who had been trafficking drugs into the U.S., and it was high time for the U.S. to remove him from power. Democrats here are saying this is simply illegal internationally. By international law, this was an illegal move. And also, the U.S. did not sign up for getting involved in a long or prolonged engagement with Venezuela, which includes running the country. And interesting to note that we saw the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, comment a little bit earlier in talking about his opposition to this. And he asked a few questions that I thought was interesting. He said, how many American troops will be on the ground in Venezuela? What does it mean for America to run Venezuela until a transition takes place? Were these military strikes about seizing foreign oil to benefit friends of the Trump administration? All of these points being asked by members of Congress. And then perhaps most importantly, we've seen from numerous members of Congress, they wanted to demand that the president come to them for a war powers resolution for any sort of military action in Congress. Well, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said during that press conference, we didn't need to ask Congress for a war powers resolution. And he said this was a different mission. It was about arresting Maduro. That will be questioned this week on the Hill.
Sumi, thank you. We're just going to go to Venezuela's Vice President now, Delcy Rodriguez, who's been calling for calm unity. So let's have a listen to her.
Los comuneros, los campesinos, los pescadores, toda Venezuela unida en un solo concepto productivo.
This is Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez making an appeal for calm and unity. She's saying the country will never be a colony of any nation. This is Venezuela's Delcy Rodriguez. She has also called for the release of Venezuela's former president, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, who've been captured by US forces in Caracas and taken off to face criminal charges in New York. Calling again for calm and unity in the country amid so much uncertainty, and Donald Trump saying that the United States is now going to run the country, but it's still unclear exactly what that is mean. So that is the Vice President. Let's go to Mimi Swaby, our World Affairs correspondent, who joins me now. Well, we're hearing there from the Venezuelan Vice President, but there is all this uncertainty, isn't there, about what happens next in Venezuela?
Exactly. There is some sort of power vacuum now that President Maduro, the disputed leader, has been extracted with his wife by the US and forcibly removed from power. Now, his inner circle, four key players really, are still very much loyal and have all come out and said statements about unifying Venezuela and fighting against this US aggression. And like we're hearing from Vice President Delcy Rodriguez saying this is a colonial war against Venezuela and really refusing to let US aggression override their governance. Now, we've seen again from other officials, including the Defence Minister, the Foreign Minister and Internal Affairs Minister, again, key players here, all supporting and rebutting the US intervention. This does beg the question, if Nicolás Maduro has been ousted, surely one of these figures will now fight for his place. Now, Delcy Rodriguez is the obvious choice, being vice president constitutionally. She is next in line to fill that empty seat.
She's actually just said there is only one president of Venezuela, and that is Nicolás Maduro. So these are live comments from Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. But does that make it all even more uncertain? Because Donald Trump, as I say, he says, well, they might have to put boots on the ground.
It does. This press conference we've had just a couple of hours ago just adds more questions than gives any answers. We understand now that the US is planning to run Venezuela until a fair and just judicial transition can happen. But if the vice president isn't going to assume power, as one would have thought, she's exercising somewhat of power. We've seen multiple statements made now on national state television. If she isn't going to fill that vacuum, that leaves it wide open for somebody else, either in Maduro's current government or the opposition. An interesting comment President Trump made, though, was that the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, she wouldn't make a good leader. It would be hard for her to lead, and she doesn't have enough respect within the country. Now, this comment will confuse the opposition. President Trump has been an ally and advocate of the opposition for some time now, and Marina Corina Machado has said that Edmundo Gonzalez, who is widely thought to have fairly won the election in 2024, the presidential election, it's thought that he now should assume the presidency, take his mandate and rebuild democracy in the country, the words there of the opposition leader. If this is not going to happen, if the US aren't going to back the opposition led by Maria Corina Machado to take power, again, it just adds more questions. Will the US actually put boots on the ground? Another grey area they touched on but refused to answer concretely. Or will they lead from afar with their kind of covert mission? We understand that the CIA was involved in telling the US about the whereabouts, the exact location of Nicolas Maduro before this very sophisticated operation. Will something like that play and come into play now? Through multiple layers of his governance, there'll be some kind of questions and areas opening up for the US to exploit, but those specific areas and people that will be used by the US for their advantage in the coming days, whatever that governance or ruling looks like, is a huge question which many Venezuelans will be confused about and very concerned what the answer may be.
Just to reiterate what the Vice President has been saying, Delcy Rodriguez, she's saying the Venezuela will never be a colony of any other nation, that Nicolas Maduro is the rightful president of Venezuela. She's also calling for calm and unity. But it's interesting, isn't it, that Donald Trump hasn't endorsed Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, as you say, who, when she won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was thought to be a contender for it as well, they spoke on the phone, didn't they? And he warmly congratulated her, and they had a good conversation. So is it perhaps a bit surprising he's refusing to endorse her as the next leader of Venezuela? It
is very surprising. She even attributed and kind of honoured the Nobel Peace Prize to President Trump himself, alongside all Venezuelans saying the Nobel is ours. The opposition will have thought with some certainty now that this operation has paved the way for the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, to be helped by the US to assume this position. That now doesn't seem as clear. It will come as a shock. It will come as an unwelcome surprise by many. The opposition and some within the opposition, citizens and politicians alike, have looked at the US military intervention alongside this huge build-up just outside of Venezuelan waters, the numerous strikes we've seen, these deadly strikes on alleged drug trafficking vessels. They have seen all these operations coming together for this large extraction of the leader as the only hope to oust Nicolas Maduro and install the opposition, using words from them. If that isn't going to happen, the question is, well, why have the US done this? Oil has been repeatedly mentioned in the press conference, as well as drug trafficking routes and narco-terrorism, all allegations that Nicolas Maduro and his wife will now face in the US. But the question still stands of if Delcy Rodriguez is stating that Nicolas Maduro is the only president and she will not assume that role, and the opposition aren't being endorsed by the US to do so, who is going to fill that vacuum in the meantime and the long term?
Mimi, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. And you mentioned oil, so let's talk a bit more about that, because Donald Trump, during his news conference, had this to say about the economic opportunities he said are available for both Venezuela and the United States.
As everyone knows, the oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping and what could have taken place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. And we are ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. So we were prepared to do a second wave if we needed to do so. We actually assumed that a second wave would be necessary, but now it's probably not. The first wave, if you'd like to call it that, the first attack was so successful, we probably don't have to do a second, but we're prepared to do a second wave, a much bigger wave, actually. This was pinpoint, but we have a much bigger wave that probably won't have to do. This partnership of Venezuela with the United States of America, a country that everybody wants to be involved with because of what we were able to do and accomplish, will make the people of Venezuela rich, independent, and safe. And it will also make the many, many people from Venezuela that are living in the United States extremely happy. They suffered. They suffered. So much was taken from them. They're not going to suffer anymore.
President Donald Trump there. Well, we could go live now to Venezuela and speak to a journalist there, Cici de Flavis, who's in the capital, Caracas. Thank you so much for being with us. What are people there saying about what has happened, about this U.S. military action and the capture by U.S. forces of Nicolas Maduro?
Yes, thanks for having me. Today has been a very bittersweet day. Obviously, it started in the midst of the night. It was a lot of uncertainty. Everyone was unsure of what was happening. Would it be bigger than it actually was? Are people going to be targeted? All this stuff. Then when the news broke that Maduro was captured, there was this overall sense of relief amongst people. People started messaging each other, just kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's happening. It just seemed like something that the Venezuelan people were waiting for so long finally took place. And then now, after hearing Trump's press conference and everything he was saying about taking over Venezuela and kind of governing for the next few little while, uncertain of the timeline, but then him having a conversation with Delcy Rodriguez, all of that started creating this bitterness, excitement, just like a sour taste in people's feelings here in Venezuela, at least. Because not only does that mean uncertainty of who's actually going to lead the country moving forward, but also it just seemed like Trump is, I don't want to say like he wasn't really serious about ending this regime and the systematic oppression because he's talking to Delcy. So it just felt like a little bit of a slap in the face. People were excited of like, okay, Trump is going to help us get rid of this regime. And then now he's talking to people within the regime. So then it was just a swirl of emotions.
And we've seen those pictures, well, that extraordinary picture of Nicolas Maduro, the former president, captured, handcuffed, blindfolded, we're told, on an American naval vessel, the USS Iwo Jima, being taken to the United States to face criminal charges in New York on drugs charges, narco-terrorism charges. What are people making of that when they see their former leader like that, handcuffed and blindfolded?
Well, with Maduro, he kind of stepped into power without a proper election. So there was an election that was not respected, and this is before 2024. So people were always, he was not as popular as Chavez was back in the day, for example, within the Venezuelan population. So from last year, when there was another election where he actually lost, but just claimed himself into power anyways, as a dictatorship does, I think people were just slightly making mockery of these images that are being shared of Maduro. Some people are saying he's finally getting what he deserves. He had like a water bottle in the images, and so people were sending on WhatsApp like, oh, don't even give him water. So I think overall there's this sentiment of relief. There's also it's a strong image of someone that has been hurting the country for so long, and now people are like, oh my gosh, he's being taken away. So that's from the Venezuelan people. And I know Trump is definitely making this to make a statement of, look, if you're messing with me, then this is how I can make you look. So, yeah, kind of shocking overall.
Are you and other people in Caracas, are you surprised by what happened last night? Were you, in a way, maybe expecting it because of that huge build-up of U.S. military activity around Venezuela?
100%. Over the last month, Venezuelan people inside and outside of the country have been on the state of alert, just kind of like waiting what's going to happen, if something was going to happen. So I think within the Venezuelan population, we're so used to expecting the unexpected. But also everyone had really high hopes are building up over the last few months. Like, oh, is Trump actually going to do something? Will the international stage do anything for Venezuela? Or would it just stay quiet as it has been over the last few decades, where it seems like Venezuela gets some action in the news media, nationally, internationally, and then it just goes silent and nothing changes. So I know a lot of people were just kind of in that limbo of like, there's a lot of anticipation, but nothing really is going to happen. So when I first felt the vibration last night of the planes and I heard it around 1:57 a.m. My first instinct was, oh my gosh, the Americans are actually here. And then when I saw the fires and the bombs falling over the mountain, one, it was very shocking. And then I was in disbelief personally. I was like, I can't believe it's actually happening. So it feels, in a sense, it's like, wow, something did actually happen. But now everyone's like, okay, how are we going to move forward from this? And what does this actually mean for us inside of the country and outside of it?
And when you saw those explosions and that military activity, what did you think? I mean, were you fearful? Were you scared at all? Did you think this was a full-scale invasion?
Well, again, it was very unknown. Like, nobody really knew what was going to happen on January 3rd. People were just kind of letting go from Christmas and New Year. So everyone's just kind of on a chill mindset, I would say. Like, we had dinner planned with family and stuff like that. So when this was happening, also at midnight, there was so much uncertainty of what it was going to be. Of course, at the beginning, I thought it was going to be full on scale. Genuinely, it was so surprising to see the parts of it lit up in orange and the smoke coming out. We were uncertain at the time of what was getting targeted. So it was very shocking. Honestly, I was shaking until like 8 a.m. as I was doing my live reportings. I'm still a bit shaking too. There was a lot of news happening, but around 4:20 a.m., it kind of stopped. So I think we understood that it was not going to be a full-on blown execution. It seemed very targeted and it was very deliberate. It was very much like specific targeted areas. And then genuinely everything went quiet. Everyone went to bed. The city itself just kind of like quieted down. Obviously there was a few commotions and talks and everything. But yeah, it started very, very uncertain, very like high alert, everyone calling each other. And then after 4:20, everyone was like, okay, this is too quiet. Maybe we should just go to bed.
And do you think the hope of many Venezuelans was that Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, would now be swept into power? Because Donald Trump seemed to like her. He's had phone calls with her and so on. But now he said she's not the right person to run the country. She doesn't represent enough people. So he's not backing her to replace Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, so I think that comment from Trump was very shocking for most Venezuelans. Obviously, there was an election last year, and Maria Corina Machado was able to gather a lot of Venezuelan supports inside and outside of the country. Maybe she wasn't as popular a few years ago. She's been in politics for a long time, but definitely during the last election, she managed to gather a lot of people, a lot of support. And then obviously she just won the Nobel Peace Prize. So people were very hopeful that she was going to either be the next leader or whatever it's going to be. But Trump's comment today of saying that she didn't have enough support, it was very shocking for people. But also from what I'm hearing from my colleagues and my friends is that it's also not a smart move for Maria Corina to, let's say, reinstall it right away. That also wouldn't be a democracy if Trump were to be like, oh, I'm just going to put this person in power now. I do think we need to have an election. Obviously, we haven't had a good track record over the last few years on elections and being respected of the Venezuelan vote. So I think it's also a tricky situation for Maria Corina. She cannot just come in and be like, I'm going to be your president. So it seems like a bit of a turmoil situation in terms of politics in Venezuela.
And although people may be relieved to see the back of the president, Nicolas Maduro, are they also a little bit worried when Donald Trump says the United States is going to run Venezuela? Are people thinking, well, what does that actually mean?
100%. And there's also was not really a concrete timeline of, oh, I will help you become a democracy within the next few months or a year or something. It was just very much like, oh, we will take care of Venezuela. So honestly, some of the conversations that people were having in a joking kind of way to kind of live through this moment. It was like, oh, are we becoming a U.S. colony? What's happening? Are we getting colonized? So in a sense, in a joking way, but also in a very concerning way, like truly what's going to happen to Venezuela right now. And I know Trump mentioned a couple of times that obviously he has the best interests of Venezuelan people, but at the end of the day, obviously he has his own agenda. And yeah, there's just a lot of uncertainty for us. And it was a very, very, very bittersweet moment when he said that. It was just very shocking.
And what is life like now, today, in Caracas, where you are? I mean, has it returned to normal? Are people going out onto the streets? Are they a little bit worried? Are they staying at home?
Yeah, so most people are staying at home. They're just not transiting to other places. Obviously, stores and everything are closed. Groceries are open, and there are very long lineups of people trying to stock on food. There's also lines for gas, so people are trying to make sure their cars are filled up just in case of an emergency. So everyone right now is just staying a bit low, trying to gather ammunitions, let's say, for food and safety, and just staying at home, staying put. And there was a few videos roaming around of the military moving around in motorcycles around Caracas. I haven't personally seen that or heard that, but those were some of the videos that people were sending me. But overall, people are just staying at home, trying to digest what's happening today, but also trying to digest what Trump just said, the fact that Maduro is out. It's just been a very emotional roller coaster day. So people are just getting food, getting gas, going home.
I mean, it's been great talking to you, Cici. Just one last question. What is your overall feeling now? Are you optimistic about the future of your country, or are you pretty worried?
I think I've always been optimistic. I think overall Venezuelan people tend to be very optimistic, even though we've been on this journey of dictatorship and imprisonment and all that for the last 2 decades. I think there's always hope. I have a feeling it won't be quick. I think we might have to deal with Trump over the next little while, and then reclaim our freedom again. But there is hope that this system or this regime will be taken down. But also after Trump's words today, I am unsure on how hopeful I can be. But I always have Venezuela in my mind. There's always going to be hope in there. Maybe it might not be today, it might be in 2 years, 10 years. I'm not sure when we can say that Venezuela is free. But there's always going to be hope. It's just very uncertain right now of what the next months and years are going to be like.
Great to talk to you, and very good luck to you. Thank you so much for being with us on BBC News. That's Cici de Flavis, a journalist who's in Caracas there at the capital of Venezuela. Thank you so much. Well, let's just take another listen now to some of that news conference that we heard from President Donald Trump a little bit earlier on at Mar-a-Lago in Florida.
Okay, thank you very much. This is big stuff, and we appreciate you being here. Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice. This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history. And if you think about it, we've done some other good ones, like the attack on Soleimani, the attack on al-Baghdadi, and the obliteration and decimation of the Iran nuclear sites just recently in an operation known as Midnight Hammer, all perfectly executed and done. No nation in the world could achieve what America achieved yesterday, or frankly, in just a short period of time. All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. It was dark. The lights of Caracas were largely turned off due to a certain expertise that we have. It was dark and it was deadly. But captured along with his wife, Celia Flores, both of whom now face American justice. Maduro and Flores have been indicted in the Southern District of New York, it's Jay Clayton, for their campaign of deadly narco-terrorism against the United States and its citizens. I want to thank the men and women of our military who achieved such an extraordinary success overnight with breathtaking speed, power, precision, and competence. You rarely see anything like it. You've seen some raids in this country that didn't go so well. They were an embarrassment. If you look back to Afghanistan, or if you look back to the Jimmy Carter days, they were different days. We're a respected country again, like never before. These highly trained warriors operating in collaboration with U.S. law enforcement caught them in a very ready position. They were waiting for us. They knew we had many ships out in the sea, just sort of waiting. They knew we were coming. So they were in a ready, what's called a ready position. But they were completely overwhelmed and very quickly incapacitated. If you would have seen what I saw last night, you would have been very impressed. I'm not sure that you'll ever get to see it, but it was an incredible thing to see. Not a single American service member was killed, and not a single piece of American equipment was lost. We had many helicopters, many planes, many people involved in that fight. But think of that, not one piece of military equipment was lost, not one service member was, more importantly, killed. The United States military is the strongest and most fearsome military on the planet by far, with capabilities and skills our enemies can scarcely begin to imagine. We have the best equipment anywhere in the world. There's no equipment like what we have, and you see that even if you just look at the boats. You know, we've knocked out 97% of the drugs coming in by sea. 90%. Each boat kills on average, 25,000 people. We knocked out 97%. And those drugs mostly come from a place called Venezuela. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about. We want peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela, and that includes many from Venezuela that are now living in the United States and want to go back to their country. It's their homeland. We can't take a chance that somebody else takes over Venezuela that doesn't have the good of the Venezuelan people in mind. We've had decades of that. We're not going to let that happen. We're there now, and what people don't understand, but they understand as I say this, we're there now, but we're going to stay until such time as the proper transition can take place. So we're going to stay until such time as we're going to run it, essentially, until such time as a proper transition can take place. As everyone knows, the oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping. and what could have taken place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. And we are ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. So we were prepared to do a second wave if we needed to do so. We actually assumed that a second wave would be necessary, but now it's probably not. The first wave, if you'd like to call it that, the first attack was so successful, we probably don't have to do a second, but we're prepared to do a second wave, a much bigger wave, actually. This was pinpoint, but we have a much bigger wave that probably won't have to do. This partnership of Venezuela with the United States of America, a country that everybody wants to be involved with because of what we were able to do and accomplish, will make the people of Venezuela rich, independent, and safe. And it will also make the many, many people from Venezuela that are living in the United States extremely happy. They suffered. They suffered. So much was taken from them. They're not going to suffer anymore. The illegitimate dictator Maduro was the kingpin of a vast criminal network responsible for trafficking colossal amounts of deadly and illicit drugs into the United States. As alleged in the indictment, he personally oversaw the vicious cartel known as Cartel de las Solas, which flooded our nation with lethal poison, responsible for the deaths of countless Americans, the many, many Americans. Hundreds of thousands over the years of Americans died because of him. Maduro and his wife will soon face the full might of American justice and stand trial on American soil. Right now, they're on a ship they'll be heading to, ultimately, New York. And then a decision will be made, I assume, between New York and Miami or Florida. But we have people where the overwhelming evidence of their crimes will be presented in a court of law. And I've seen it. I've seen what we have. It's both horrible and breathtaking that something like this could have been allowed to take place. For many years after his term as president of Venezuela expired, Maduro remained in power and waged a ceaseless campaign of violence, terror, and subversion against the United States of America, threatening not only our people, but the stability of the entire region. And you all saw it. In addition to trafficking gigantic amounts of illegal drugs that inflicted untold suffering and human destruction all over the country, all over, in particular, the United States, Maduro sent savage and murderous gangs, including the bloodthirsty prison gang, Tren de Aragua, to terrorize American communities nationwide. And he did indeed. They were in Colorado. They took over apartment complexes. They cut the fingers off people if they called police. They were brutal, but they're not so brutal now. And I just have to congratulate our military, Pete and everybody, and our National Guard, because the job that they've done, whether it's in Washington, D.C., where we have a totally safe city, where it was one of the most unsafe cities anywhere in the world, frankly, and now we have no crime in Washington, D.C. We haven't had a killing. We had the terrorist attack a few weeks ago. A little bit of a different kind of a threat. But we haven't had a killing in a long period of time, 6-7 months. We used to have two, on average, 2 a week in Washington, our capital. We don't have that anymore. The restaurants are opening. Everyone's happy. They're going, they're walking their daughters, they're walking their children, their wives. They walk to restaurants. Restaurants are opening all over Washington, D.C. So I want to thank the National Guard. I want to thank our military. And I want to thank law enforcement. It's been amazing. And they should do it with more cities. We're doing it, as you know, and we're doing it in Memphis, Tennessee right now, and crime is down We've just sort of started a few weeks ago, but crime is down now 77%. And the governor of Louisiana called, great person, and he wanted us to help him, as you know, in a certain very nice part of Louisiana, and we have done that. And it was a rough section, and we have crime down. I understand it's down to almost nothing already after 2.5 weeks. New Orleans, it's down to almost nothing, and we've only been there for 2.5 weeks. Can't imagine why governors wouldn't want us to help. We also helped, as you know, in Chicago, and crime went down a little bit there. We did a very small help because we had no working ability with the governor. The governor was a disaster, and the mayor was a disaster. But it knocked down crime. But we're pulling out of there when they need us. We'll know. You'll know. You'll be writing about it. And likewise, Los Angeles, where we saved Los Angeles early on, where the head of the police department made a statement that if the federal government didn't come in, we would have lost Los Angeles. That's long after the fires. That's when they had the riots in Los Angeles. We did a great job. Got no credit for it whatsoever, but that's okay. It doesn't matter. We don't need the credit. But we'll be pulling out when they need us. They'll call, or we'll go back if we have to. We'll go back.
Well, that was just some of Donald Trump's news conference earlier on in the day, talking about the reasons that he had ordered US troops to go into Venezuela and to capture its president, Nicolas Maduro. And our State Department, Tom Bateman, has this analysis for us on the impact of Donald Trump's actions in Venezuela.
He ran on this America First idea, and there is a very strong feeling within big parts of his base that means non-interventionism, not getting involved in what was seen as foreign entanglements, adventurism in the past. And so the build-up to Venezuela, we've had 3 months basically where you've had the world's biggest aircraft carrier, huge naval presence there, deadly strikes on alleged drug boats, and at least one land strike, in which there have been those within his base who have questioned how this adheres to this idea of not trying to get involved elsewhere. We heard Mr. Trump himself in the Middle East on his first major foreign visit of this term, saying it wasn't for the US, in his words, to look into the souls of foreign leaders and judge their actions and tell them what to do. And yet you have this raid on the Venezuelan capital, which has captured the leader of a foreign nation, albeit one that had won an election, had taken office illegitimately after an election, according to all the independent analysis of that election result, but a major intervention in the affairs of a foreign country by the United States. So that question is being asked. I think we're hearing, the pushback against that from Marco Rubio and others there, that they've said this is an America First action, they say, because this is about, first of all, the rule of law. When they'd indicted Maduro over drugs allegations, he'd always said that was just an excuse for regime change. But also the idea that they have consistently pushed that drugs from Latin America kill hundreds of thousands of Americans per year, they say, and blame Venezuela for being a key part of that, despite the fact that actually the illicit trade from Venezuela is a relatively small part of what goes on in the region, and also, of course, a very significant domestic public health and criminal elements to how you tackle what is basically an synthetic opioid epidemic in this country. And again, it's mostly cocaine from Venezuela. But that has been the tension here. I think what the administration is hoping now is that they've got a kind of clean operation finished with his capture. He then goes, faces potential trial in New York along with his wife, and that they can get some kind of transition towards what they want. But the question now is all about that plan, or lack of. We heard some sort of contradictions from Mr. Trump saying the US is now running Venezuela, but then appearing to endorse Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, now they confirmed sworn in as president, and appeared to give a stamp of approval to that. And I was just talking to one resident of Caracas, a supporter of the opposition in Venezuela, saying, basically saying they think justice has been served in the removal of Nicolas Maduro, but voicing voicing, in her words, disappointment at what she heard from Mr. Trump about what happens next. But I think many Venezuelans will hope that to some degree they can just take matters into their own hands now. But there didn't seem to be confidence about, the US's role in what happens next.
That's Tom Bateman there reporting from Washington. So just to sum up what we've heard today, Donald Trump saying the United States launched those strikes that we saw on Venezuela and captured its president, Nicolas Maduro. He said the United States is now going to run Venezuela until such time as we can do a safe, proper and judicious transition. Donald Trump and his team released pictures of them watching that US military action unfolding in Venezuela as Maduro was captured by US forces. They said it was, Donald Trump said it was like watching television. And this was Maduro blindfolded, handcuffed as he was flown out of Venezuela and taken to the United States to face charges. Just hearing that British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has said the UK government will discuss the evolving situation in Venezuela. The UK has long supported transition of power in Venezuela. Plenty more to come on what is happening in Venezuela. You're watching BBC News.
Hello, live from London, this is BBC News. President Trump says the United States intends to run Venezuela following the capture of Nicolas Maduro in a military raid on Caracas.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
These pictures are from the Situation Room as more than 150 US aircraft took part in the overnight raid.
This operation, known as Operation Absolute Resolve, was discreet, precise, and conducted during the darkest hours of January 2nd and was the culmination of months of planning and rehearsal.
Mr. Maduro, seen here in the last known video taken of him before his arrest, is currently on his way to New York, where he'll be tried on drug and terrorism charges. And Venezuela's Vice President Delcy Rodriguez has been addressing the nation on state television. She says Nicolas Maduro is Venezuela's only president. Hello, I'm Lucy Gray. Welcome to the programme. We continue our coverage this hour of an extraordinary day for Venezuela. Those US strikes in the early hours of Saturday. Explosions were heard in the capital, Caracas, as well as in other cities. US forces captured the Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro and his wife during an overnight raid. This photo was later posted by the president on his Truth Social account. Mr. Maduro now faces narco-terrorism charges in New York. Mr. Maduro's support base remains defiant. In the last hour, we've heard from Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. She's called for calm, but says that there's only one president of Venezuela, and that is Mr. Maduro. Her comments follow a lengthy press conference by US President and his team at Mar-a-Lago. There, Donald Trump detailed the events overnight and said that the US would be running Venezuela until such time as an orderly transition can be achieved.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious, because that's what we're all about. We want peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela, and that includes many from Venezuela that are now living in the United States and want to go back to their country. It's their homeland. We can't take a chance that somebody else takes over Venezuela that doesn't have the good of the Venezuelan people in mind. We've had decades of that. We're not going to let that happen.
Our South America correspondent Ione Wells reports on this unfolding story.
Handcuffed, blindfolded, captured from his country. This is Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, being sent to the US after being seized by US forces.
It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice. It was dark, and it was deadly. But captured along with his wife, Celia Flores, both of whom now face American justice. Maduro and Flores have been indicted in the Southern District of New York, it's Jay Clayton, for their campaign of deadly narco-terrorism against the United States and its citizens.
The capture led many wondering who would now run Venezuela. And then, this.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Washington says Maduro will face charges including conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism and import cocaine. His seizure was part of a huge military operation. Venezuela's capital, Caracas, woke to the sound of the city under attack. Helicopters, flames, explosions. These were strikes on the city's key military sites. Eyewitnesses woke in the early hours to the sound of booms. This marks the biggest US military intervention in the region in decades. For months, Washington has sent troops, warships and aircraft to the Caribbean. It has seized oil tankers near Venezuela and carried out dozens of strikes on alleged drug boats, killing at least 110 people. Operations, it says, are part of an armed conflict against traffickers. But legal experts say it may breach the laws of war. The US has long accused Nicolás Maduro of running a criminal network, claims he denies. Just days ago, he said he was open to talks.
If they want to seriously discuss an agreement to combat drug trafficking, we're ready. If they want Venezuelan oil, is Venezuela ready for US investments? Like with Chevron, whenever, wherever and however they want.
What remains of Venezuela's government says it will fight, but the US wants regime change. And today, the US showed once again it will use whatever force it takes to get what it wants. Ione Wells, BBC News.
Well, the last day has seen a remarkable change in fortunes for the Venezuelan leader. This is believed to be Maduro's final public appearance before US military forces launched a large-scale strike on Caracas. He was meeting the Chinese special envoy on Friday. And during what was said to be a cordial meeting, Mr. Maduro received a decorative vase and presented the Chinese diplomat with a painting in return. Then, within just a few hours, Trump shared this image on Truth Social that he says shows Nicolás Maduro on board the USS Iwo Jima. This is the vessel that he earlier told Fox News was bringing the Venezuelan leader to the US. Well, let's talk through all of this with our chief presenter, Sumi Sumaskanda, who's been following the events. And what an extraordinary 24 hours or so. We've had the capture of Maduro, then we've had Donald Trump saying that the US is going to run Venezuela. He also talked about US oil companies going in, and in terms of who is in charge or who is going to be in charge, he talked about having spoken to the vice president, but then she went on state TV saying that Nicolás Maduro is the only possible president. Just talk us through, if you can, these lightning fast developments.
Yeah, Lucy, truly extraordinary, as you said. And if you take it back even further, we understand from what we heard from the president and his team today that this actually has been in the making, in the planning, for a few months now, for several months. Remember that those strikes on boats off the coast of Venezuela began in September, the Trump administration saying these were strikes on narco traffickers, as they call them, bringing drugs to the United States. Of course, they haven't provided evidence of the identities of those on board. More than 30 strikes to date and more than 100 people killed. We also saw just last month the U.S. blockading oil tankers, so sanctioned oil tankers bringing oil to and from Venezuela. We know oil is the central pillar of Venezuela's economy at the moment. And then, as you said, the last 24 hours, this remarkable development. We understand from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, who spoke at that very press conference, that the U.S. began the operation overnight because the weather had cleared. In fact, the U.S. military, he said, was waiting, watching for their moment. And then entered Venezuela at around 1 a.m., we understand, helicopters under air cover from the U.S. Air Force, and then went to the compound, the heavily fortress compound that was holding Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and was there able, this special Delta Force team, to apprehend Mr. Maduro and his wife. And we understand it was about 2 hours, a little bit more than 2 hours later, that the extraction team, if you will, this Delta Force special mission, was able to leave Venezuela again, once again under cover of the U.S. Air Force. They did receive some return fire, we understand, but there were no serious injuries, and one helicopter did sustain some damage but was able to return as well. And at the end of this mission, as you said, that remarkable press conference where we saw President Trump say that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela, he said, we have no other choice. We cannot let somebody else come in to continue the situation simply as it has been. That situation, from his perspective, is one, the fleeing of thousands and thousands of migrants from Venezuela. He has said Venezuelan prisons emptying into the U.S. hasn't provided evidence for that. And two, the drug smuggling that he has said has been led by President Maduro. Again, President Maduro has rejected that characterization of being the head of a drug cartel. And as to what that will look like, the U.S.'s presence in Venezuela, we simply aren't clear on that, Lucy. You know, he said that, as you mentioned, he had spoken, or Secretary of State Marco Rubio had spoken to the Venezuelan vice president. well, if she is saying that Venezuela will not be a colony of any country, what could that cooperation look like? Could there be further military intervention? We simply don't know at this point.
And he was quite quick, wasn't he, to rule out really working with the leader of the opposition. He said that Maria Corina Machado said, I think it would be very tough for her to be the leader. She doesn't have the support or the respect within the country. She's a very nice woman, but she doesn't have the respect, he said.
That particularly remarkable, Lucy, because as we know, she won the Nobel Peace Prize and called Donald Trump after winning the prize to thank him as well. There are a number of staunch figures of the Venezuelan opposition who have been heavily lobbying Washington to continue their pressure campaign on Nicolas Maduro and to have reached this point where Maduro has been extradited essentially from Venezuela to face charges in the U.S. and to hear that President Trump does not intend to put the leader of their opposition into position to lead this transition will raise a lot of questions, also one of democratic legitimacy. Remember that the reason that Nicolas Maduro is not considered the legitimate leader of Venezuela by the U.S. and, to be fair, many other countries, including European countries, is because he lost the election to Edmundo González, supported by Maria Corina Machado. If there is to be a democratic transition, the question will be asked, why wouldn't the Venezuelan opposition be part of that? We are hoping to speak to some members of the opposition located here in the U.S. and put that question directly to them. But President Trump clear that this will be a U.S.-led mission and also very much centered on oil. American companies going to extract oil from the ground in Venezuela, he says, to benefit Venezuelans and those companies. But the shape of that is still unknown as well.
And just briefly, Sumi, there's been criticism from internationally, particularly from France, saying that this operation violates the principles of international law. But also, can you just quickly talk us through some of what the Democrats have been saying in their criticism of this?
Yeah, there has been severe criticism from Democrats. A number of Democrats here have been saying that President Trump carried out this operation against international law, that he is getting U.S. troops involved in harm, putting them in harm's way. And in fact, we saw the Democratic leadership, the House Democratic leader, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and the Senate Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer released the following statement. They said President Trump's announced plan to run Venezuela is unacceptable. It is critical that the Trump administration provide an immediate Gang of 8 briefing, followed by briefings for all members of the House and Senate early next week. And just a note on that, Lucy, the Gang of 8, these are the 8 members of Congress that are traditionally briefed on classified information in Congress. They are demanding that that briefing take place. We heard the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say a little bit earlier, well, Congress did not have to be notified because this was not a mission of war. Essentially, it was a mission to arrest Mr. Maduro and his wife and to hold him to account in U.S. courts on those charges that the Department of Justice has released with this indictment for the Southern District of New York against Maduro and his wife.
OK, thank you for now very much, Sumi Skanda, for us there in Washington. Well, Venezuela's mission to the United Nations has requested a meeting of the Security Council and called on them to condemn the military strikes. Venezuela's ambassador, Samuel Reynaldo Moncada Acosta, said the United States of America always uses lies to fabricate wars. It is an international tyranny imposed with the propaganda of death. Before continuing to say Russia and China, allies of Venezuela and permanent members of the Council, have requested the Council convene an emergency meeting this weekend. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado has said that her country's hour of freedom has arrived and the opposition is ready to take over. But as we were saying, President Trump has expressed doubt about Ms. Machado's ability to take over, claiming that despite her party's seeming success in the 2024 presidential election, she does not have the support or respect of the people. Well, earlier, the Venezuelan opposition leader posted a statement on social media saying, given Nicolas Maduro's refusal to accept a negotiated exit, the government of the United States has fulfilled its promise to enforce the law. She went on to say, today we are prepared to enforce our mandate and take power. We are going to restore order, release the political prisoners, build an exceptional country and bring our children back home. Well, in the letter, Machado also added that Edmundo González, who the US has recognized as Venezuela's president-elect, must immediately take office and be recognized as the country's commander of the armed forces. Well, let's speak now to reporter Gabriela Mesones Rojo, who is in Caracas. Hello to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Perhaps if I could just start with that, what we were just saying about the opposition there, and what President Trump was saying about the leader of the opposition not having the respect within the country. What was your reaction to that?
Hi, Lucy. Thank you so much for having me. So Maria Corina Machado has been a controversial leader for over 2 decades. She has had an extremely long career. And of course, she has had different perspectives and different postures. However, for the last year, it is safe to say that
Oh, I think we seem to have lost the line to Gabriela there. We will have a go at trying to re-establish that line, but I think for the moment we're having a few issues. Oh, I think, hold on, I'm just being told we might have her back. Gabriela, can you hear me?
Well, yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Do continue. You just froze for a second, but you're back. So carry on.
I'm so sorry. I'm struggling with internet today. It's been particularly slow after the events of this morning.
That's understandable.
So as I was mentioning, during the past year, Maria Corina has been, without doubt, a highly respected leader. She won the primary elections with 90% of the votes, which is something that had never happened before in primary elections in Venezuela. And then she was inhabilitated and she wasn't allowed to run for office. So she left Edmundo González Urrutia as the person in the ballots for her. And Edmundo won by a landslide. Ever since, Maria Corina has been a very respected leader. I also want to highlight that Maria Corina's ideology has usually been at the center of the critiques against her. And yes, many people, I think, don't necessarily agree with Maria Corina's ideology or with some of her proposals. But that still doesn't mean that people didn't vote for her despite these differences. Maria Corina has proven in the last year to be a democratic leader that has been fighting for democratic values in Venezuela. And I think that is particularly what is moving people and what moved people to vote for her in the last year. Okay. Of course, Maria Corina has a controversial career. In 20 years, she has, of course, said and done a lot of things that, many people could reject or not approve. But at the moment, I can say that Trump's statement that Maria Corina isn't respected or valued in Venezuela is actually false. She is considered the primary opposition leader in Venezuela at the moment.
Okay. But more generally then, how are things in Venezuela today? How does it feel? What's the atmosphere like? How are people feeling? What are they saying?
So to summarize it in one word, I would say uncertain. I think it's also a very contradictory moment because on one hand, Maduro has been a disaster for Venezuela. More than 7.9 million people have fled the country. It's one of the biggest refugee crises in the region. We have been in a complex humanitarian emergency since 2014. The last year, since the presidential elections were contested, repression and persecution have become the new normal. So the last year has been a particularly cruel year for Venezuelan. Many people have been exiled. Many people have been disappeared. Many people have been imprisoned. It's been a hard situation for the past year. So, of course, some people are happy to see some sort of justice take place. They are happy to see that Maduro has been detained and that somehow he will pay for some of his crimes. However, there is so much uncertainty, so much disinformation, so much lack of information from the Venezuelan government, and quite honestly, a lot of incoherent information coming from the U.S. government as well. So right now, I think people are less celebratory and more scared and trying to survive the uncertainty of the next couple of days. The streets are completely silent. Most of the stores are closed. Very few supermarkets and gas stations are open. So there are huge hour-long lines in order to buy food. And I think people are just trying to get this little survival things done in order to see what's going to happen now and how these next 48 hours are going to look in Venezuela.
Yes, it's been almost quite a muted reaction, hasn't it? Because there's not been, large crowds out on the street waving flags like we have seen in some other countries in response to this, and there hasn't been sort of opposition out on the streets either. It's been quite a quiet response. Is that something to do with the state of emergency and the fear?
Yes, definitely. People haven't really taken to the streets since the presidential election, where there were protests, 25 people died, and there was the biggest wave of repression that we had seen in Venezuela's modern history. So after that, fear shaped the lives and the statements and how Venezuelans express themselves. This isn't only in protest. You can see it in Venezuelans talking in a restaurant about politics. They go quieter. So without a doubt, people are very afraid. Also, I have to say that the morning was pretty traumatic. It was not something we expected. I think, in the media, we have been talking a lot about soil airstrikes happening in Venezuela. But we didn't expect them to happen in Caracas, and we definitely didn't expect them so soon. So it was a pretty traumatizing morning. People woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of bomb certainty, no information at all. We didn't even know if it was U.S. airstrikes or Venezuelan planes and helicopters, if it was some sort of coup. So at the moment, I think people are playing it safe. And instead of celebrating or protesting, everyone is just hoping to stay at home. We also don't know if other bombings are going to take place. So without a doubt, people are just hoping to take care of themselves and their family and keep safe at home.
OK. Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you. That's Gabriela Misones talking to us from Caracas there. Let's get some more reaction from the region. Colombia's president has said his country's forces were being deployed to the border. Gustavo Petro said on social media the United Nations Security Council must be convened immediately, establish the international legality of the aggression against Venezuela. He then went on to say the UCP, which means unarmed civilian peacekeeping, is activated and the operational plan is in place at the border. Well, let's talk through some of this now with Jeffrey Korn, a professor of law at Texas Tech University and a former U.S. Army senior advisor for law of war issues. In terms of under whose authority this operation was, what would you be answering that?
Well, it's very clear that the president directed the operation. He gave the directive to the Secretary of Defense, which is the senior civilian leader of the Department of Defense. That directive was then transmitted to an operational command, very likely Joint Special Operations Command, to execute a plan that had been in place for some time, according to the administration.
And in terms of what we've heard from places like France saying that this operation violates the principles of international law on the use of force, what will be the US answer to that? I mean, we've got some sense of how they will respond, haven't we, today from that press conference that we saw from Donald Trump talking about how America was being threatened as people and the stability of the entire region was being threatened. Is that what you would expect to hear more of?
So to be very clear, I agree with the critics that assert that there is no plausible or credible legal basis to justify this military action under international law. And I've taken that position with regard to the entire campaign against these drug boats. But we have seen that the administration has tried to build an architecture of legality around this narco threat, analogizing the activities of narco gangs to groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, which is really on its face absurd because these groups are not trying to attack the United States. There's no surprise to me that they are now doubling down on that theory. They were green-lighted on this with this double tap incident that began as a controversy and ironically ended up as a windfall for the administration because it was very clear that the Republican-controlled Congress was not in any way interested in challenging the operations or the validity of this legal basis. And I think it probably influenced the decision to take it this further step and conduct the operation against Maduro. I'm not even sure they really care that much about the international legal basis at this point. When I listened to President Trump today, it was in many ways, in my mind, using this operation to signal to other countries in the region and other leaders that the United States is going to be willing to use its military power when it decides it's in its interest, and it will just come up with some implausible legal theory to justify it. And I think that's a cause of great concern because of the destabilizing effect it has on the international community and the limitations on the use of force by states who see it as an easy solution to hard problems.
There were similar allegations put against the leader in Panama, weren't there, to justify the invasion of Panama in 1989. Is this comparable to that?
No, this is a false analogy. It's interesting for me because I began my military career as an intelligence officer in Panama during the Noriega era. I was there when he was indicted. I was there when our relationship with the Panamanians collapsed. And he stood under indictment for 2 years before the invasion. He shared a base with the United States military. We literally had military forces within a block of his headquarters for 2 years, and we never acted to apprehend him. There were 2 coup attempts we could have participated in and supported, and we chose not to. The invasion of Panama was not justified as an effort to apprehend Noriega because of his drug activities. That was a fringe benefit. The invasion of Panama was justified because the Panamanian Defense Forces had started to use violence against Americans in Panama, and President Bush, in my view, justifiably concluded that the situation had changed radically, and there were 20,000 Americans in Panama in jeopardy of deadly violence, and the only way to protect them was to neuter the Panamanian Defense Forces, some of whom literally were a fairway away, a Gulf fairway away from U.S. family housing in Panama. So this analogy, which I think we are going to hear frequently in the coming days, is a false analogy. This was not an act of self-defense, and it was not an act to defend U.S. nationals that were in imminent danger of violence. It was a military action to enforce an arrest warrant in the territory of another country, and that's not justified under international law.
OK. Thank you so much for talking to us. We have to leave it there. But thank you for your time. Jeffrey Korn, Professor of Law at Texas Tech University. Do stay with us here on BBC News.
Well, Colombia has been reacting to events in neighbouring Venezuela. The president has said his country's forces are being deployed to the border of Venezuela. Gustavo Petro said on social media, the United Nations Security Council must be convened immediately, establish the international legality of the aggression against Venezuela. He then went on to say that the UCP, that means unarmed civilian peacekeeping, has been activated and the operational plan is in place at the border. Well, let's talk about what's happening in Colombia, Venezuela's neighbour, now with Dan Kovalik. He's an international human rights lawyer, a lawyer for the Colombian President Gustavo Petro. And thank you for being with us. Donald Trump said today that his Colombian counterpart, Gustavo Petro, should watch his ass after the US military operation. What do you make of it all?
Well, I'm very saddened by the events of the last several hours. I think, well, it's very clear that the overthrow of Nicolas Maduro was in violation of international law. And now that he's threatening other leaders like Petro, like the president of Mexico, I've heard Ortega as well, Nicaragua being threatened. I mean, this is outrageous. The U.S. doesn't run the world. It shouldn't run the world. Under the UN Charter, all these countries have a sovereignty. They're considered equal under the law, under the UN Charter. And Trump is violating the spirit and the language of the UN Charter.
Well, Colombia has been reacting to...
This is BBC News, the headlines. President Trump says the United States intends to run Venezuela following the capture of Nicolas Maduro in a military raid on Caracas. These pictures are from the Situation Room as more than 150 US aircraft took part in the overnight raid. Mr. Maduro, seen here in the last known video taken of him before his arrest, is currently on his way to New York, where he'll be tried on drug and terrorism charges. Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, has been addressing the nation on state television. She says Nicolas Maduro is Venezuela's only president. Well, we're continuing our coverage of the US strikes on Venezuela. President Trump has announced that the United States will run Venezuela until an orderly transition can be achieved. He said he wasn't afraid of putting boots on the ground. His comments came hours after US forces captured the Venezuelan leader and his wife during an overnight raid in Caracas. Mr. Trump said Mr. Maduro would soon face narco-terrorism charges in New York. We're just hearing that the UN Security Council will meet at 10 a.m. New York time on Monday for an emergency meeting on Venezuela. The briefers have not been confirmed, but could include the UN Secretary General. The meeting was requested by Colombia and was supported by Russia and China. So the UN Security Council to meet at 10 a.m. New York time on Monday. Well, outside of Venezuela, people have gathered both to protest and celebrate the US strikes and the subsequent capture of Nicolas Maduro. We can show you now some live pictures that we have. This is Mexico City, as a group of people have gathered there to protest against the US strikes on Venezuela. We can now show you Buenos Aires. This is Buenos Aires in Argentina, where crowds are celebrating the capture of Nicolas Maduro. And there are similar scenes in Doral, a city in the US state of Florida. We've got a reporter there, and we will cross to him later on this half hour. But it was interesting earlier talking to that reporter inside Caracas, who was saying that people have not really been taking to the streets at all inside Venezuela to protest or celebrate what's been going on. It's been a very muted reaction in terms of visibility out on the streets, perhaps because of so much uncertainty, she said. Well, let's take another listen to some of that news conference that the president gave earlier at Mar-a-Lago.
Okay, thank you very much. This is big stuff, and we appreciate you being here. Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice. This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history. And if you think about it, we've done some other good ones, like the attack on Soleimani, the attack on al-Baghdadi, and the obliteration and decimation of the Iran nuclear sites just recently in an operation known as Midnight Hammer. All perfectly executed and done. No nation in the world could achieve what America achieved yesterday, or frankly, in just a short period of time. All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. It was dark. The lights of Caracas were largely turned off due to a certain expertise that we have. It was dark, and it was deadly. But captured along with his wife, Celia Flores, both of whom now face American justice. Maduro and Flores have been indicted in the Southern District of New York, it's Jay Clayton, for their campaign of deadly narco-terrorism against the United States and its citizens. I want to thank the men and women of our military who achieved such an extraordinary success overnight with breathtaking speed, power, precision, and competence. You rarely see anything like it. You've seen some raids in this country that didn't go so well. They were an embarrassment. If you look back to Afghanistan, or if you look back to the Jimmy Carter days, they were different days. We're a respected country again, like never before. These highly trained warriors, operating in collaboration with U.S. law enforcement, caught them in a very ready position. They were waiting for us. They knew we had many ships out in the sea, just sort of waiting. They knew we were coming. So they were in what's called a ready position. But they were completely overwhelmed and very quickly incapacitated. If you would have seen what I saw last night, you would have been very impressed. I'm not sure that you'll ever get to see it, but it was an incredible thing to see. Not a single American service member was killed, and not a single piece of American equipment was lost. We had many helicopters, many planes, many people involved in that fight. But think of that, not one piece of military equipment was lost, not one service member was, more importantly, killed. The United States military is the strongest and most fearsome military on the planet by far, with capabilities and skills our enemies can scarcely begin to imagine. We have the best equipment anywhere in the world. There's no equipment like what we have, and you see that even if you just look at the boats. You know, we've knocked out 97% of the drugs coming in by sea. 90%. Each boat kills on average, 25,000 people. We knocked out 97%. And those drugs mostly come from a place called Venezuela. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. And it has to be judicious because that's what we're all about. We want peace, liberty, and justice for the great people of Venezuela, and that includes many from Venezuela that are now living in the United States and want to go back to their country. It's their homeland. We can't take a chance that somebody else takes over Venezuela that doesn't have the good of the Venezuelan people in mind. We've had decades of that. We're not going to let that happen. We're there now, and what people don't understand, but they understand as I say this, we're there now, but we're going to stay until such time as the proper transition can take place. So we're going to stay until such time as we're going to run it, essentially, until such time as a proper transition can take place. As everyone knows, the oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping and what could have taken place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. And we are ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. So we were prepared to do a second wave if we needed to do so. We actually assumed that a second wave would be necessary, but now it's probably not. The first wave, if you'd like to call it that, the first attack was so successful, we probably don't have to do a second, but we're prepared to do a second wave, a much bigger wave, actually. This was pinpoint, but we have a much bigger wave that probably won't have to do. This partnership of Venezuela with the United States of America, a country that everybody wants to be involved with because of what we were able to do and accomplish, will make the people of Venezuela rich, independent, and safe. And it will also make the many, many people from Venezuela that are living in the United States extremely happy. They suffered. They suffered. So much was taken from them. They're not going to suffer anymore. The illegitimate dictator Maduro was the kingpin of a vast criminal network responsible for trafficking colossal amounts of deadly and illicit drugs into the United States. As alleged in the indictment, he personally oversaw the vicious cartel known as Cartel de las Solas, which flooded our nation with lethal poison, responsible for the deaths of countless Americans, the many, many Americans. Hundreds of thousands over the years of Americans died because of him. Maduro and his wife will soon face the full might of American justice and stand trial on American soil. Right now, they're on a ship they'll be heading to, ultimately, New York, and then a decision will be made, I assume, between New York and Miami or Florida. But we have people where the overwhelming evidence of their crimes will be presented in a court of law. And I've seen it. I've seen what we have. It's both horrible and breathtaking that something like this could have been allowed to take place. For many years after his term as president of Venezuela expired, Maduro remained in power and waged a ceaseless campaign of violence, terror, and subversion against the United States of America, threatening not only our people, but the stability of the entire region. And you all saw it. In addition to trafficking gigantic amounts of illegal drugs that inflicted untold suffering and human destruction all over the country, all over, in particular, the United States. Maduro sent savage and murderous gangs, including the bloodthirsty prison gang Tren de Aragua, to terrorize American communities nationwide, and he did indeed. They were in Colorado. They took over apartment complexes. They cut the fingers off people if they called police. They were brutal, but they're not so brutal now. And I just have to congratulate our military, Pete and everybody, and our National Guard, because the job that they've done, whether it's in Washington, D.C., where we have a totally safe city, where it was one of the most unsafe cities anywhere in the world, frankly, and now we have no crime in Washington, D.C. We haven't had a killing. We had the terrorist attack a few weeks ago, a little bit of a different kind of a threat, but we haven't had a killing in a long period of time, 6-7 months. We used to have two, on average, 2 a week in Washington, our capital. We don't have that anymore. The restaurants are opening. Everyone's happy. They're going, they're walking their daughters, they're walking their children, their wives. They walk to restaurants. Restaurants are opening all over Washington, D.C. So I want to thank the National Guard. I want to thank our military. And I want to thank law enforcement. It's been amazing.
That was Donald Trump speaking at Mar-a-Lago a little earlier in a really extraordinary press conference in which he said that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela after that operation overnight in which the President Maduro and his wife were captured. They are now on their way to New York, where Maduro has been indicted in New York on drugs and weapons charges. We also heard in that press conference him talking about oil, saying that U.S. companies are going to go into Venezuela. He said the oil business in Venezuela has been a bust. And he said U.S. companies are going to go into the country, spend billions, fix the oil infrastructure and start making money for the country. He also talked about how they had been ready to go in and stage a much larger second attack if need be, but he said that's probably not necessary now. He also talked about how the lights of Caracas were turned off by the US during that operation due to what President Trump described as certain expertise that America has. Let's bring in our correspondent, Sean Dilley, who is in Washington for us. And Sean, just such an extraordinary few hours that we've been talking through. People will be sitting at home watching this saying, how on earth could he just go into another country and capture their president and take them to America? Based on what you've heard today from President Trump, how is he justifying this?
His justification is simple. He says that President Maduro, or he would argue not President Maduro anymore, had posed a threat to Americans inside America, largely through harm that he was alleging was bringing drugs into the United States. And essentially what his argument was that they are pursuing an action against a criminal for somebody who needs to be held accountable through criminal courts. But how you square that circle to where he says, well, in the meantime, we'll step in, and he's talking about the United States, and run a transitional government. It's quite extraordinary. I don't know about people waking up asking that question, but I know this morning in the early hours, waking up to a knock at my door, running over what happened, thinking, well, crikey, President Trump had been saying for a while that he was considering direct action, but, you know, did anybody imagine that this would be the action?
It's been interesting to see the international response to this, hasn't it? We've seen France saying that this operation violates the principles of international law. Spain has said it didn't recognise Maduro's regime, but nor will it recognise an intervention that violates international law. Sir Keir Starmer here in the UK has said they're monitoring the evolving situation, but that we will shed no tears about the end of Nicolas Maduro's regime. Really, people still trying to figure out how to react to this, aren't they?
Yes, and I think certainly Russia and China are among those who might be more traditionally foes towards the United States position, but they've expressed grave concerns. South Africa have actually said that there needs to be a gathering of the United Nations to discuss this urgent issue. So all of the countries you've set out there all coming up with their positions. So Keir Starmer, who is reasonably allied on a personal level, not just perceptions that some people have in the United Kingdom of a special relationship. So I think some people are choosing their language quite carefully. So Keir's comments there that they will be shedding no tears is very different to the process of removing the president of Venezuela. So an awful lot of people are going to be asking questions about that. But for now, here's what happens next. President Maduro, or just plain old Nicolas Maduro, depending which way you look at it, will be arriving into New York, having been detained in a complex that's been described as fortified by President Trump. He will be handed from military custody into essentially law enforcement custody. He'll appear at some point in the next couple of days in the Southern District of New York in a federal court as any old plain criminal defendant, which you know, if you think about it, is pretty surreal. But that does mean that he would have all of the rights that any other criminal defendant would have. That would be the right to silence, the right not to testify. All of the usual processes of a criminal trial you'd expect to be gone through as quickly as possible. So the next stage is called the arraignment, where Mr. Maduro would stand there alongside his wife, we'd expect, and various others also indicted, including a son of his, will have the charge read to them. Now, that's the formal start of the case. In relation to the usual discussions that prosecution and defence would have about plea bargains, to be honest, nobody knows whether Mr. Maduro will even participate in the process. There's going to be international calls that it should or shouldn't be. But here's going to be the interesting thing. Here's what you want to watch out for. The defence lawyers for Mr. Maduro and others indicted, including his wife, will almost certainly make an argument that the court doesn't have jurisdiction to hear the case. Now, that would be down to the judge to decide and weigh up those legal arguments that President Trump says, well, it was in lawful defence, essentially, of Americans, versus those who argue, well, hang on a minute, this was a military action overseas. Then, if it does proceed to a trial, the situation with all federal trials, criminal trials in the United States, and nearly all states as well, is a jury would have to unanimously find the defendant guilty of the crimes they're accused of.
OK, thank you so much for talking us through all that. Sean Dilley for us there in Washington. Let's cross now to Doral in Florida. We can speak to our White House reporter, Bernd Debusman, who is there. It's been such an interesting day, apart from anything else, because of the contrasting reaction to Venezuelans inside Venezuela and those outside of Venezuela. Tell us what it's been like where you are.
Well, Doral is very much the heart of South Florida's Venezuelan expatriate and Venezuelan American community. And many of the people here fled specifically from the Maduro regime, or before that from the government of Hugo Chavez. And they are absolutely ecstatic. For the last few hours, I've been at a Venezuelan restaurant, which is very much the hub of the community here in Doral. And it's been packed with people since about 4:35 in the morning. Behind me, you might be able to hear them. There's still about several hundred people here celebrating. They really always, most of them told me they always wanted to see the Maduro regime fall and never really thought it would. So they're very surprised, pleasantly surprised in their opinion. This is something they've wanted for quite some time.
And just explain to me what the reaction was when people heard Donald Trump saying that the US is going to run Venezuela, at least until the transition of power.
Well, to be clear, a lot of the people I spoke to here are overwhelmingly thankful for Donald Trump. Many people made the point that various U.S. administrations in the past had been opposed to Maduro and to Chavez and did nothing. And they see Trump as someone who has actually gone and done something. Now, there is some concern and questions among people about what that transition looks like. In the long term, many people told me they see the current Maduro regime officials having roles in the future as something of a red line. They really see that regime as something that Venezuela needs to rid itself of almost entirely. So there's a lot of questions about that. But overall, I would say they're very optimistic about the future, particularly the economic future of Venezuela, which they see as something that they think will rise in the near future.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Donald Trump sort of ran on this non-interventionist agenda, didn't he? Where he's saying he wasn't going to get involved in foreign wars and the like. And his base seemed to be, in favour of that. He doesn't seem to be really sticking to it, though, does he?
He doesn't. That's something I asked people here. Interestingly enough, there were almost as many Make America Great Again red hats as there were Venezuelan flags in the rally behind me. So that's something I asked quite a few people. But they don't see this as breaking that vow at all. They see this as kind of a very short-term surgical intervention rather than the kind of long-term state building that we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan in the past, for example. They very much see this as a very direct, very kind of pointed humanitarian intervention in Venezuela's favor.
OK, well, thank you very much for now. That's our White House reporter, Bernd de Boosman, for us there in Doral in Florida. I think we also have some pictures we can show you of Buenos Aires as well. Let's see if we can show you them. Yeah, these are people in Buenos Aires responding to the events in Venezuela, very much in favour of what's been going on. We've also seen, we can go to Miami as well, I think. Let's have a look there. People taking to the streets, wrapped in the Venezuela flags as well. Very interesting earlier talking to that reporter who we spoke to, Gabriela, in Caracas, who was saying that people really haven't been out on the streets in Caracas today, in the streets of Venezuela. They were so concerned and uncertain about the situation. She was saying that you didn't see people going out and celebrating, or those in opposition to what had happened, because they're just so uncertain, although very much people going to fill up their cars for petrol and getting supplies to see themselves through the coming days. Do stay with us here on BBC News. Plenty more to come.
Live from Washington, this is BBC News. President Trump says the United States intends to run Venezuela following the capture of Nicolás Maduro in a military raid on Caracas.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
These pictures are from the Situation Room as more than 150 U.S. aircraft took part in the overnight raid.
This operation, known as Operation Absolute Resolve, was discreet, precise, and conducted during the darkest hours of January 2nd and was the culmination of months of planning and rehearsal.
Nicolás Maduro, seen here in the last known video taken of him before his arrest, is currently on his way to New York, where he will be tried on drug and terrorism charges. And Venezuela's Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, has been addressing the nation on state television. She says Maduro is Venezuela's only president. I'm Sumi Somaskanda. Thank you for watching BBC News. President Donald Trump says the United States has captured Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro after launching strikes on the country. President Maduro, seen here on board the USS Iwo Jima, is being brought to the U.S. to be indicted on drug trafficking and weapons charges. His wife, Celia Flores, was also captured by U.S. forces in an overnight raid. They could appear in a New York courtroom as soon as Monday. President Trump shared these pictures on Truth Social, which appear to show him and other officials watching the strikes on Venezuela and the capture of President Maduro and his wife. Alongside him are his Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Dan Kane, the U.S.'s most senior military officer. He said no U.S. service members were killed in the operation, and he claimed that Venezuelan forces were completely overwhelmed. In remarks to reporters on Saturday, President Trump said the U.S. is, quote, going to run Venezuela until the time comes where there can be a, quote, safe, proper, and judicious transition of power. He was pressed on how exactly the U.S. would ensure this, but did not provide any further details. The capture of President Maduro follows allegations from the Trump administration that Venezuela is one of the biggest suppliers of illegal drugs to the U.S. That is a claim that has not been verified by the BBC. He also called Mr. Maduro an illegitimate dictator in his speech, referring to his disputed re-election in 2024. Here's how President Trump began that dramatic announcement.
Late last night and early today, at my direction, the United States Armed Forces conducted an extraordinary military operation in the capital of Venezuela. Overwhelming American military power, air, land, and sea, was used to launch a spectacular assault. And it was an assault like people have not seen since World War II. It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolás Maduro to justice. This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history. And if you think about it, we've done some other good ones, like the attack on Soleimani, the attack on al-Baghdadi, and the obliteration and decimation of the Iran nuclear sites just recently in an operation known as Midnight Hammer, all perfectly executed and done. No nation in the world could achieve what America achieved yesterday, or frankly, in just a short period of time. All Venezuelan military capacities were rendered powerless as the men and women of our military, working with U.S. law enforcement, successfully captured Maduro in the dead of night. It was dark. The lights of Caracas were largely turned off due to a certain expertise that we have. It was dark and it was deadly. But captured along with his wife Celia Flores, both of whom now face American justice. Maduro and Flores have been indicted in the Southern District of New York. It's Jay Clayton, for their campaign of deadly narco-terrorism against the United States and its citizens.
Well, President Trump also discussed the key topic of oil. He said U.S. oil companies will go into Venezuela to fix its oil infrastructure and start making money for the country. He had this to say about the economic opportunities for both Venezuela and the U.S.
As everyone knows, the oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time. They were pumping almost nothing by comparison to what they could have been pumping and what could have taken place. We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country. And we are ready to stage a second and much larger attack if we need to do so. So we were prepared to do a second wave if we needed to do so. We actually assumed that a second wave would be necessary, but now it's probably not. The first wave, if you'd like to call it that, the first attack was so successful, we probably don't have to do a second, but we're prepared to do a second wave, a much bigger wave, actually. This was pinpoint, but we have a much bigger wave that probably won't have to do. This partnership of Venezuela with the United States of America, a country that everybody wants to be involved with because of what we were able to do and accomplish, will make the people of Venezuela rich, independent, and safe. And it will also make the many, many people from Venezuela that are living in the United States extremely happy. They suffered. They suffered. So much was taken from them. They're not going to suffer anymore.
Okay, let's talk about all of that with our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. He is following the latest. Tom, a lot of questions being asked about what this all means, what the U.S. plans for Venezuela. What is the latest that you've been hearing?
Well, I think the point is Donald Trump is extremely vague, and that may be in part deliberate. You know, it's a sort of trademark ambiguity to keep people guessing to a certain extent. But my impression from that is that there is not a precise and pinpointed plan at this stage beyond some of the things he seemed to be alluding to there. So, you know, obviously when he was asked about who's running Venezuela, he came up with this line, well, it's the people behind me. You know, so he's talking about members of his cabinet, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, the Chair of the Joint Chiefs, Dan Kane, and others, i.e. it's the US administration. Donald Trump is running Venezuela, having deposed Nicolas Maduro. But I think there was a sort of key moment where he referred to the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, and the fact he revealed that Secretary of State Rubio had had a very long conversation, he said, with her, in which the implication from Mr. Trump is that there was this now compliant de facto leader in Venezuela, and that this would be the process towards some kind of transition, the objective of which is not a sort of great hallelujah moment of democracy and a just future, although those words are being mentioned. But the real ambition, and we heard him repeatedly mention it, is American access to Venezuelan oil fields. So that's the end game strategically, as far as he is concerned, as well as this whole idea of they expect stability in countries in America's backyard, although you might argue that going and invading a country and deposing its leadership is not how to engender stability. That said, of course, you know, it's very clear from all the independent analysis that Nicolas Maduro was not the legitimate leader of the country, but there will be those, you know, in the country will say this is simply a pretext, not least Maduro himself. So in terms of the plan, it feels pretty vague. When he was pushed on US boots on the ground, you know, are you going to back this up with any kind of ground invasion? He simply said, we're not afraid of that. So I think what he's relying on now is the notion of compliance. And there was a clear threat to those still running, you know, still in charge, that if they don't do what the US wants, they'll get a repeat of what has just happened here. That feels like a very high-risk strategy. And I think what makes this, in part, the biggest gamble in terms of foreign policy so far of Donald Trump's second term.
It's been an extraordinary turn of events, a buildup of a few months now of seeing the U.S. military build up in the region. There has been a lot of criticism here from Democrats, a lot of support from Republicans. What has stood out to you in terms of how people are reacting to this?
Sure. I mean, in Congress, we've seen, I've been there repeatedly during this build-up of, naval forces largely, but also, quite a lot of special forces in the area as well, in the Caribbean Sea. They're over about 3 months, and we've had these deadly attacks on alleged drug boats, at least one land strike, and a partial blockade of oil tankers already in the lead up to this. The view of many Democrats in Congress has been that this is simply unconstitutional because they think Donald Trump hasn't got the authorization of Congress to do this. And we've heard those voices being amplified from Democrats today saying this is basically illegal and risks greater instability. I think it's worth noting that Marco Rubio was the voice there that really tried to narrow the confines here. So he was saying this is simply about a law enforcement issue, that Nicolas Maduro and his wife have been indicted by the Justice Department. And this was, he suggested, being kind of led by the justice system with the Department of Defense, or Department of War as they call it now, kind of backing up this quite narrow and legally specified process. But of course, what has happened here is the removal of a foreign leader in their sovereign country. And I think we heard much more of that from Donald Trump, who wasn't sort of so worried about the nuances and the legalities of this, other than to say that he expects now stability in the country and for Venezuela to do what the US wants. And if not, as I say, there is the continuation of that threat there.
How do you think this lines up with Donald Trump's foreign policy agenda?
Well, he was asked that question in the press conference, is this America first? Because, of course, that has been a key theme, and big parts of his base do not want to see so-called foreign entanglements, exactly this kind of thing, foreign interventions that they believe opens a Pandora's box without a plan for the aftermath. And if you then have, an uprising, chaos in the streets, you then have to fix it. So he was asked about that, and we saw this in some of the statements in the run-up to the press conference from the administration, that this is, in their view, is about saving American lives, because they are putting together the issue of drug trafficking, drug cartels and people smuggling in Latin America, and that being, as far as this administration is concerned, the biggest national security threat to the United States. They've made that very clear, particularly in their national security strategy, that they see Latin America as the most pressing issue. And he said, 300,000 people a year dying from the issue of drugs. And that is why I think we're seeing him try to marry the idea of this still being an America First approach to his foreign policy.
Okay, Tom Bateman, thank you very much for that reporting. We'll hear from you, of course, through the course of the evening. Now, reaction has been coming in from around the world to the U.S. operation in Venezuela. In the UK, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, said Britain was not involved in any way in the American action. He says he wants to talk to President Trump to establish facts. Russia, meanwhile, called the U.S. strikes deeply concerning. Our World News correspondent Joe Inwood reports.
It is hard to overstate the significance of this moment. The capturing of the Venezuelan president and his wife is an event without precedent. Nicolas Maduro has been in power since 2013. His authoritarian regime clung onto power in highly disputed elections. In recent months, Venezuelan forces have been on high alert, a response to the ramping up of pressure from the US. And last night, that pressure turned into decisive action.
The coordination, the stealth, the lethality, the precision, the very long arm of American justice, all on full display in the middle of the night. Nicolas Maduro had his chance, just like Iran had their chance, until they didn't and until he didn't. He effed around, and he found out.
The closest historical parallel is the capture of Panamanian President Manuel Noriega on this very day in 1990. Like Maduro, he too was accused of drug trafficking, but his capture was only achieved after a full-scale ground invasion. Venezuela's allies, including Russia, have condemned today's events, while even the US's closest partners have not all welcomed it.
It can be absolutely clear that we were not involved in that, and as you know, I always say and believe we should all uphold international law. But I think at this stage, fast-moving situation, let's establish the facts.
The capture of a sitting president in this way is unlike anything seen before, as is President Trump's claim that the US will run Venezuela. This feels like a turning point for the country and the region. The question is, in which direction? Joe Inwood, BBC News.
We can speak now to Rebecca Bill Chavez, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us. First, let's just get your reaction to what we've seen unfold today.
Yes, I mean, this is a significant escalation, to say the least. One of the things that was just mentioned is the comparison to Panama. And I think what I'd like to highlight there is, advocates of this sort of military intervention, unilateral intervention, have been pointing to Panama as a sort of model. And I just want to highlight that is not it's not a really valid comparison, because Panama is a much smaller country. It was a very different scenario than what we're seeing in Venezuela. I think this removal of Maduro is the relatively easy part. I think what comes next is the issue. This is a huge territory with very mountainous terrain in some parts. There are large ungoverned swaths of territory, and there are multiple competing armed groups that have a vested interest in kind of maintaining the sort of situation that was there under Maduro. We have dissident members of the Colombian guerrilla movement, the ELN movement. You have dissident members of the FARC, the Colombian FARC guerrilla movement. You have the very powerful transnational criminal organizations that are engaged in illegal mining and other illicit activities. And so the idea that the U.S. is going to come in and govern in this scenario is very worrisome, without some sort of concrete plan, which we haven't heard about.
Rebecca, what about your sense of the Venezuelan military? We understand they have been, of course, very loyal to President Maduro. Yeah. What role do you anticipate they will be playing in the coming days and weeks?
That's an excellent question, because I think when the U.S., in 2019, when the U.S. hoped to initiate some sort of change, the belief was that there would be these high-level military defections. We have not seen that in Venezuela. The military has been incredibly loyal to Maduro for two reasons. One is the use of carrots. If you look at the structure of the Venezuelan military, they have benefited immensely economically from the Maduro regime. And so there have been a lot of payoffs, kickbacks to the military, but also the use of sticks. So Maduro has, ensured loyalty of the Venezuelan military largely through the use of Cuban intelligence officers in Venezuela to make sure that there are not the defections. And as a result, we see a large number of members of the Venezuelan military in Venezuelan prisons. So this issue of defections, it's not clear or that there will be defections on the scale that the U.S. would like.
What about what we know on the targets, these sites that were targeted in the strikes and where Maduro was located? What do you make of the entire operation as it was carried out?
So, from what we know, it was, a strike within the city, within Caracas. Of course, there's been an emphasis on the fact that there have not been U.S. Civilian casualties. But now the U.S. is going to be responsible for protecting Venezuelan civilians as well. And this idea, I would highlight this idea of a second wave. To me, that sounds like U.S. boots on the ground, which would, mean some sort of significant ground incursion, which would be very different than this precision strike that we've heard about. And that could lead to a long kind of prolonged low intensity conflict, a sort of quagmire for the U.S., where we would see U.S. troops in Venezuela for, a prolonged period of time. And as was mentioned earlier, the national security strategy, which was just released, highlighted the fact that the Trump administration does not want to engage in these sort of forever wars, would have been coined forever wars.
Okay, Rebecca Bill Chavez, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have your analysis with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Meanwhile, the Venezuelan opposition leader and Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado has said her country's hour of freedom has arrived and the opposition is ready to take over. But President Trump said it would be, quote, very tough for her to lead. He claimed that despite her party's success in the 2024 presidential election, she does not have the support or the respect of the Venezuelan people. Earlier, the Venezuelan opposition leader posted this statement on social media. It said, given Nicolás Maduro's refusal to accept a negotiated exit, the government of the U.S. has fulfilled its promise to enforce the law. She went on to say, today we are prepared to enforce our mandate and take power. We are going to restore order, release the political prisoners, build an exceptional country, and bring our children back home. In the letter, Machado also added that Edmundo Gonzalez, who the U.S. has recognized as Venezuela's president-elect, must immediately take office and be recognized as the country's commander of the armed forces. Let's speak now to our White House reporter, Bernd de Busman. He is in the Miami suburb of Doral, Florida, where there is a large Venezuelan diaspora population. He's been covering this for the last few hours. Bernd, it's very good to see you. What has the reaction been there?
Well, it's, in a word, ecstatic. I'm currently at a restaurant here in Doral, which is very much the hub of the Venezuelan and Venezuelan American community here in South Florida. And since about 4:30 or 5 a.m., it's been absolutely packed. There's still about several hundred people behind me. You might be able to hear them. They've been playing music and dancing. And generally, it's a very jubilant scene. Many of these people fled Venezuela. Some fled from the Maduro regime. Some fled from his predecessor, Hugo Chavez. But there's really no love lost there for the Venezuelan government as it stood. So they're very, very pleased with what Donald Trump has done and very thankful to him personally.
Bernd, what do they make of the U.S. going onto Venezuelan territory to arrest Nicolás Maduro? Questions asked, of course, about the legality of this. Is that something that is all a concern to those Venezuelans you've been speaking to?
It's not been something that's much of a concern to the folks that I've been speaking with here. They see this very much as a surgical kind of humanitarian intervention rather than a large-scale war that could have cost, many hundreds or thousands of Venezuelan lives. They see this as very pointed and very targeted against Maduro, a man which most of them, quite frankly, loathe. And they see this overall as a good thing. There are some questions, of course, about what the future holds, but in the short term, they're very happy that Maduro is gone.
What about the role of the opposition? We mentioned that Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Prize winner, she had released that statement. President Trump, however, saying she doesn't have the respect needed to lead the country. Is there a lot of support for her and the opposition there?
It's been certainly mixed. Many people I've spoken to have kind of identified her as the person they would like to see kind of leading Venezuela going forward. But others were much less convinced. I think where there's slightly more agreement is that most people here told me that for them, a red line, as it were, would be if people in the Maduro regime kind of transition into the new government, whatever it looks like. A lot of people here would be quite disappointed. They very much see the Maduro regime as something that Venezuela should rid itself of entirely, with no vestige going forward into whatever the next administration looks like. But that's kind of a long-term concern, and most of them have been very much focused on the short-term fact that Nicolás Maduro is no longer in Venezuela.
What about the prospect of the U.S., quote, running Venezuela, as President Trump said? Is that something they want to see?
I think there is a lot of confusion about what exactly he meant. I think people here generally wouldn't be particularly enthused of a kind of a hands-on American approach in the day-to-day administration of Venezuela's government. But they do see they interpreted that as being kind of the U.S. leading a helping hand, particularly economically. President Trump in his speech, which many people here were listening to on their phone, he identified oil in particular, and people do believe that if the U.S. helps fix Venezuela's oil industry, then everything else might fall into place. Many of them talked to me about some of the economic difficulties they had back home, and they see the Trump administration kind of helping maybe not run, but guide Venezuela's oil and gas industry forward as something that could ultimately be the key to getting the country back on track as they see it.
We heard President Trump say Venezuela is free, Venezuelans are free. From what you've heard from people there, do you imagine that we could see many Venezuelans returning to their country, depending on what happens, of course, in the coming days?
Well, it's certainly something that at least several people here mentioned to me, that they think that particularly if the economy of Venezuela improves, that they believe a lot of people here from Doral, for example, might go back. If the economy is better the way they see it, there'd be more opportunity. There'd be cash getting injected into Venezuela's economy, and many of them left for economic reasons as well as reasons of insecurity or issues with the government. So that's certainly a possibility that people here seem open to.
Okay, Bernd de Busman reporting for us there from Miami, where that large Venezuelan population has been celebrating today. Bernd, thank you so much. We'll be speaking to you a bit later in the evening. Now, Venezuela's mission to the United Nations has requested a meeting of the Security Council and called on them to condemn the military strikes. Venezuela's ambassador, Samuel Reynaldo Moncada Acosta, said the United States of America always uses lies to fabricate wars. It is an international tyranny imposed with the propaganda of death. He went on to say Russia and China, allies of Venezuela and permanent members of the Council, have requested that the Council convene an emergency meeting this weekend. Let's speak now to Juan Gonzalez, he's former National Security Council Director for Western Hemisphere Affairs under President Biden. Juan, it's good to have you back with us here on BBC News. What do you think of the operation that the U.S. carried out to arrest President Maduro and his wife?
Well, thanks for having me. The first thing I would say, I was just very impressed by the ability of Special Forces and Delta Force. I never thought, given the complexity of the mission, that they would be able to extricate Maduro. I mean, this is the regime that's been coup-proofing for 26 years. So that was incredibly impressive of special operators. I think more importantly here, I think it is a bipartisan issue that Nicolas Maduro lost the election and needs to leave. And certainly the Venezuelan people deserve to live in freedom and democracy. And it certainly, as your previous correspondent mentioned, it's understandable that there's a lot of hope today. But at the same time, U.S. history is full of regime change moments that feel good on day one and frankly didn't age well. I think we can only hope this isn't another case, especially when the president has said that we will run Venezuela, which to me looks like autocrat change and not regime change. And I think the real test is whether this will lead to elections or locks in Maduro light. The Venezuelan constitution, if there's a change in government or there's a removal or a departure or a death of the president within the first half of the term of the presidency, the constitution requires an election within 30 days. Is that something that the Trump administration is going to be focused on? Is that something that that Delcy Rodriguez and the rest of the government in Venezuela is going to be responsive to? I mean, if you look at the president's press conference, the focus was very much on oil and less on really the democratic dividend that may come out of this operation.
Yeah, on Delcy Rodriguez, we heard her speaking a little bit earlier in the day saying Venezuela will not be a colony of anyone, a very defiant message there, despite the fact that President Trump said the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, had spoken to her in a long conversation. From your understanding of President Maduro's inner circle, the higher up people in his government, do you see them working with this Trump administration?
I think there are two scenarios here. The first is that this is the beginning of a negotiation. And so the president's exfiltration of Maduro and the arrest really gives him a lot of leverage, the threat of future invasion, to actually negotiate something with Delcy and the rest of the cabinet. And, the question is this going to be, as I said, Maduro light? The other scenario is potentially, I think, chaos. Are the regime operators going to close ranks and work together? Is there going to be instability? As has been described earlier on the show, there are a lot of non-state actors and kind of pseudo-paramilitary forces in the country that aren't just going to go along with the U.S. plan, and that will require boots on the ground by the United States. I think that a concern here, too, is that internationally, this is clearly a short-term win for Trump. But domestically, he has crossed a line. Many Venezuelans support the U.S. action. But inside the U.S., the public opinion runs strongly the other way. And Congress was not consulted. You've seen statements by Senator Mark Warner, who is the ranking on the Senate Intelligence Committee, but also Senator Andy Kim, Ruben Gallego, and others, really outraged, feeling that the administration lied to them when Rubio briefed them early this year, suggesting that there would not be interventions on the ground. So I think just, beyond what's happening in Venezuela, this is the debate that's going to continue inside the United States, because you can't I think that what their question is, you can't really sell a decapitation strike as a routine law enforcement in the United States.
Juan,
Members of Congress,
well,
I think, are right to have some concerns, and those assurances, I think, really now matter.
The counter to that from President Trump is that the entire region, and indeed the U.S., is much safer for Maduro no longer being the president of Venezuela. Do you agree with that?
That remains to be seen. I think there's a history of U.S. interventions that do not go well. I think everybody uses the Panama example and the Grenada example. Those are very unique. I think in Venezuela, as Dr. Bill Chavez has mentioned, is very, very complicated. I think there's a chance that they'll pull this off, right? And that there'll be a peaceful transition to Edmundo Gonzalez, who's a rightfully elected leader. But, every experience in this area suggests that this is going to be much more complicated and prolonged. And the administration, by saying Trump or Rubio said there'd be no more operations, are they just going to wash their hands of this and kind of kick the can down the road? Or, is this a break it you bought it scenario where as things go downhill, the U.S. will get much more involved? That's a problem because, this president was very much elected on ending foreign wars. And it seems like he is escalating across multiple fronts and now including in Venezuela with no clear objective, no legal authorization, and frankly, no articulated endgame. So this seems like more of like an impulse-driven escalation, not really a strategy, and it increases the risk of open-ended U.S. entanglement.
Okay, Juan Gonzalez, great to get your analysis. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
And for our viewers just joining us, we are continuing to follow developments after President Trump announced the U.S. had captured Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela. Our South America correspondent, Auni Wells, is following the unfolding story.
Handcuffed, blindfolded, captured from his country. This is Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, being sent to the U.S. after being seized by U.S. forces.
It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice. It was dark and it was deadly. But captured along with his wife, Celia Flores, both of whom now face American justice. Maduro and Flores have been indicted in the Southern District of New York. It's Jay Clayton, for their campaign of deadly narco-terrorism against the United States and its citizens.
The capture led many wondering who would now run Venezuela. And then, this.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Washington says Maduro will face charges including conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism and import cocaine. His seizure was part of a huge military operation. Venezuela's capital, Caracas, woke to the sound of the city under attack. Helicopters, flames, explosions. These were strikes on the city's key military sites. Eyewitnesses woke in the early hours to the sound of booms. This marks the biggest US military intervention in the region in decades. For months, Washington has sent troops, warships and aircraft to the Caribbean. It has seized oil tankers near Venezuela and carried out dozens of strikes on alleged drug boats, killing at least 110 people. Operations, it says, are part of an armed conflict against traffickers. But legal experts say it may breach the laws of war. The US has long accused Nicolas Maduro of running a criminal network, claims he denies. Just days ago, he said he was open to talks.
If they want to seriously discuss an agreement to combat drug trafficking, we're ready. If they want Venezuelan oil, is Venezuela ready for U.S. investments? Like with Chevron, whenever, wherever, and however they want.
What remains of Venezuela's government says it will fight, but the US wants regime change. And today, the US showed once again it will use whatever force it takes to get what it wants. Ione Wells, BBC News.
Now, speaking on state television after Maduro's capture, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, said Maduro remained the only president of Venezuela.
We demand the immediate liberation of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. The only president of Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro.
Well, in Washington, U.S. lawmakers had mixed reactions to the news. The House Speaker, Mike Johnson, posted on X saying, quote, "Today's military action in Venezuela was a decisive and justified operation that will protect American lives." Across the aisle, Democrats criticized the Trump administration. Senator Tim Kaine, said Maduro is terrible, but Trump put American service members at risk with the unauthorized attack. The American people don't want more forever wars. Senator Chuck Schumer, in a statement, says Nicolas Maduro is an illegitimate dictator, but launching military action without congressional authorization and without a credible plan for what comes next is reckless. Now, President Maduro is expected to arrive in New York by the end of the day Saturday. Before he is arraigned in New York City next week, he will first land at Stewart International Airport, about 60 miles north of Manhattan. And our North America correspondent, Neda Tawfik, is there. She joins us now. Neda, very good to see you. Tell us what is happening where you are.
Yeah, well, Sumi, behind me is the military air base, and I can tell you that even before we got here, there were a handful of protesters who had signs that said "No war, no tyranny," so coming to show their feelings about how all of this has played out. But behind me, there are some news copters circling, waiting for when Nicolas Maduro and his wife will land here. And you see that the world's press is also gathered to get those first images, because from here, he is expected to be transported onto a helicopter and taken to Manhattan. And although there is nothing ordinary about this, he will be treated as other criminal defendants in New York are treated. High profile, but nevertheless, he will be subjected to the same treatment. He will be handed over to federal authorities. He will be booked and processed, fingerprinted, having his mugshot taken. And then he will await his arraignment, the court appearance where he will be formally read his charges, and he will be able to enter a plea at that point, also be given or obtain his own lawyer. You know, and experts I've spoken to, Sumi, have said they'll be interested to see whether he and his wife, Celia Flores, have the same lawyer or different lawyers. No one expects that a request for bail will be allowed, and so it's expected he will be held without bail at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. And it could take more than a year, Sumi, for a trial to get underway. But that will be a jury of New Yorkers. And the SDNY, the Southern District of New York, you know, they have prosecuted numerous high-profile officials in the past on drug-related offenses. Remember, it was just weeks ago, in fact, that Donald Trump pardoned the former Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, from similar narco-terror offenses in that courthouse. So it'll be interesting to see, Sumi, how all of this plays out in the next few days, because, as I said, there is certainly nothing normal about this case.
Yeah, certainly, Neda. And as we await President Maduro and his wife, their arrival on that plane there in New York, what more can you tell us about the indictment itself, something the Department of Justice had released a little bit earlier today, and Pam Bondi, of course, the Attorney General, posting on social media as well?
Yeah, that's right. Look, this indictment really builds upon an indictment from 2020 against Nicolas Maduro and other Venezuelan officials. But this one adds his wife and also his son to the indictment. It accuses him of essentially using the power of government to import and transport cocaine into the United States as a weapon, to work with drug cartels, which, remember, the Trump administration has recently designated as terrorist organizations, to work with them and other corrupt officials to, you know, get those drugs transported into the United States and to profit off of that. And so the charges that he is facing is narco trafficking, the cocaine importation, as well as possession of a machine gun. And those charges, Sumi, if he is convicted unanimously by a jury in New York, he could face 30 years to life in prison.
And can you just tell us, Netta, briefly a little bit about this jurisdiction? You mentioned the Southern District of New York indeed has seen a number of high-profile cases, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Between the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of New York, let's not forget some of the high-profile drug lords that have been in those courts, as well as former officials. So you have El Chapo, the notorious drug lord from the Sinaloa cartel, the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, who was tried and convicted in New York. You also had former Mexican officials. As I mentioned, the former Honduran president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, convicted on very similar charges to what Nicolas Maduro is facing. But this really goes back decades, Sumi, that you have had the United States really pursuing these charges to send a message that the United States will pursue traffickers beyond the United States' borders to prevent the illicit trade that has taken so many American lives.
Okay, Netta, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Colombia has been reacting to events in neighboring Venezuela. The president said his country's forces are being deployed to the border. Gustavo Petro said on social media, the United Nations Security Council must be convened immediately, establish the international legality of the aggression against Venezuela. He then went on to say the UCP, which means unarmed civilian peacekeeping, is activated and the operation plan is in place at the border. So let's speak now to Patrick Murphy, Executive Director at Hilco Global, former U.S. Undersecretary of the Army. Patrick, good to see you. Good to have you back on our program. First, what did you make in particular of this operation to enter into Venezuela and arrest President Maduro?
Thanks, Sumi, for having me on. I appreciate it. So Operation Absolute Resolve was clearly a military success. Here you have Delta Force out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, where I was stationed, and 160th Night Stalkers that did this covert operation with precision, with speed. About 2 a.m. Last night, they broke through, they breached the steel doors of Maduro's compound. They captured him and his wife. They extricated them out to the USS Iwo Jima, and we anticipate them being placed up in Manhattan to be tried in the Southern District of New York, as you mentioned. But as you know, Sumi, I'm an Iraq War veteran and a former congressman and someone who had honor of running the Army under President Obama. It's really about the day after. As someone who was there in the invasion in Iraq, the day after, when we fired, the Ba'athist Party in Iraq, and there was this political vacuum, what you're going to see now in Venezuela, of the 26 million people that live in Venezuela, 300,000 of them work for that government. So we're going to see what happens now politically in Venezuela.
So, Patrick, as you mentioned, you're a former member of Congress and also served in the Iraq War. Should President Trump have tried to get congressional approval for this operation?
Absolutely. There is no doubt that Maduro was illegitimate, that he was a horrible leader. You look at 82% of Venezuelans, Sumi, live in poverty. But that does not change the fact that we have the U.S. Constitution, that the president can't just act unilaterally. This was not self-defense. This was an offensive operation. This was regime change that was done without the consent of Congress. Congress needs to grow a backbone and do their job to debate, starting this week, a new AUMF, an authorization for use for military force. And we don't see that. And I will tell you, Sumi, most Americans, they don't want forever wars. Most Americans are not happy that we have 1.1 million less jobs today than we had 1 year ago in America. So we don't want to just run Venezuela. We want to do the right thing by our Constitution. And let's hope Congress now grows a backbone and starts debating this ASAP.
So, Patrick, what President Trump and his administration have said is that this was a defensive operation in a way, because Venezuela was posing a direct threat to the United States through its drug trafficking, also through the thousands of migrants who have entered into the U.S. What is your response to that?
Listen, I was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division, right? I like being concise and to the point, but the reality is this: you can't keep crying wolf. You can't keep saying everything's an emergency. The tariffs are emergency. Like, it is not an emergency. There wasn't offensive operations that were hurting Americans. Now, again, he's a bad person. I'm glad we're going to try him. He was definitely involved as a narco trafficker and cocaine, absolutely. But this was a military operation without the consent or even advice of Congress. The Gang of Eight, the head of the intelligence committees in the House and the Senate, they didn't even know. And that is not how we conduct things. America at her best is a reluctant warrior. So we need Congress right now to do their damn job and make sure that we have this debate with the AUMF starting this week.
Patrick, just for our viewers, as you're speaking, on the right-hand side of our screen, we're looking at a plane at Stewart Air Force Base, and U.S. media are reporting that we expect that President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, are on that plane, that they're about to disembark, where they'll then be handed over to federal authorities. Of course, they'll be arraigned in New York. But Patrick, we're just looking at some people coming down the stairs, and not just yet, it looks like an agent who hasn't yet disembarked, but as we're looking at those pictures and waiting to see if indeed that is the plane that Mr. Maduro and his wife are on, what do you think that the U.S. might do in terms of boots on the ground? President Trump was asked about this, and he said, well, we had boots on the ground. Of course, he means the extraction force to get President Maduro and his wife out of Venezuela. But will that be needed, especially with Venezuela's military being so loyal to President Maduro?
Right. I mean, listen, we're all hoping for the best. And as you mentioned, Stewart Air Force Base, that's just north of the United States Military Academy at West Point. I was a professor there after I served as a prosecutor, including in the Southern District of New York. And what you're going to see is this power vacuum right now in Venezuela. Now, again, I hope there is going to be some type of peaceful transition of power, whether it's with the vice president or otherwise. But there is going to be a vacuum. And that's why when I mentioned there are 300,000 people that work in the Maduro government right now. And let's see, what happens. He was not popular. He was illegitimate. He was a horrible leader. That does not give the United States, though, the right just to go in there and have regime change, without congressional approval. And I think that's where the real frustration you're seeing in America, and not just in big cities of America, but across our land. And let's just hope that we do the right thing now and get Congress to grow a backbone and do their job now.
Patrick, back to some of the reactions that we've seen specifically in Congress, and you've talked about Congress needing to demand a war powers resolution here. We heard the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say this was a law enforcement action. This was a fugitive, essentially, of American justice. You're shaking your head, I can see, but why do you think that is not an adequate justification for this operation?
So, I was a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division. We asked our most elite unit to do this operation at Delta Force. They are not a police organization. They're not a law enforcement organization. We asked the 168th Night Stalkers to fly those combat airplanes to go in there to take him and his wife out. They did it with precision, with speed, and with the elite ability that they have. But they are not law enforcement. They're not like my father was a cop in Philadelphia for 22 years. They are the best of our U.S. military, and I'm proud of their efforts. But it doesn't change the fact that not one person, even the President of the United States, can act unilaterally. We don't have kings in our country. We have in our Constitution, in the first article of our Constitution, the very first one, this is only Congress can declare war. This was a military offensive operation. So we need Congress to do the right thing and pass an AUMF, or at least a debate one, and not just kowtow to the current person in the White House.
Okay, Patrick Murphy, really good to get your thoughts on this developing story tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sumi.
Okay, and just so you have an update now on where we are looking at Stewart Air Force Base there on your screen. That plane is believed to be carrying Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. We have not been able to confirm that yet. U.S. media are reporting that is the plane carrying Mr. Maduro and his wife. Now, we understand, of course, that this Air Force Base, which is about 60 miles from Manhattan, that President Maduro, when he does arrive there, if this indeed is the plane he's on, that he will then be transported to a place where he will be held, a facility, where he will be held before his arraignment in the Southern District of New York. That could happen as soon as Monday. We are expecting that arraignment to happen this week. That was a very quick change, of course, because just earlier today, we weren't entirely certain where President Maduro was being taken. And we heard President Trump in his press conference confirm that he was put on the Iwo Jima. That is a U.S. ship. He was put on and transported as well. So we're going to continue to keep an eye on those pictures and, of course, bring you up to date as soon as we possibly see President Maduro disembarking, perhaps from that plane, perhaps from another. We are waiting to confirm whether he has indeed arrived. As we're waiting, let's bring in Andres Martinez Fernandez. He's senior policy analyst for Latin America at the Heritage Foundation. Andres, thank you for joining us. What do you make of this operation today and President Maduro arriving any minute now in the U.S.?
I think it's historic. You know, this is a regime which has terrorized our hemisphere, not just the U.S., but across Latin America, as well as the Venezuelan people for years, and caused untold suffering, prompted the exit of millions of Venezuelans from within its borders, weaponized that, as well as weaponizing narco trafficking against the United States and against Venezuela's neighbors. So this is a historic moment. It opens up massive opportunities for a new era of stability and security in our hemisphere, and a new era of prosperity for the Venezuelan people as well. And I think that's why you see a lot of positive energy and expectation around this moment, and frankly, relief. And even when you look at the criticisms that you do see, you see it mostly coming from Russia and China and these other regimes, which while we have Latin America very broadly, which is increasingly conservative, hailing this.
So Andres, can I jump in there and ask you, we've seen some critical statements also from European leaders questioning the legality. So where do you think the legitimacy is here for the U.S. to go onto foreign soil and arrest President Maduro?
Well, I think the Trump administration has laid out very clearly that this is not a government. Nicolas Maduro is not a legitimate leader, and that is something that even European leaders recognize, and they've noted the blatant theft of elections in Venezuela, the propagating of false numbers as far as vote tallies, as well as the repression of the Venezuelan people, all as a means of maintaining power and maintaining a criminal cabal active in narco trafficking and other criminal activities. So I think that when you dig down into what is the stance that the world has come to recognize, is that this is a criminal regime, and I think certainly the Trump administration recognizes that. And as far as this action, it's an enforcement of the criminal charges that are longstanding.
When President Trump says that the U.S. will run Venezuela, what does that mean to you?
Well, I think it's not clear exactly the path that will take. There are certainly, I think, determination still to be made, but a lot of this also is in flux, in part because of the situation on the ground in Venezuela. I would say that there are numerous options. One of those being, certainly what comes to mind for a lot of folks, is the U.S. military being on the ground and managing everything and keeping everything in order and taking things over. I don't think that's what the Trump administration has in mind. I think what we're likely to see is pressuring from the economic, diplomatic, and political side to ensure that we have a transition that maintains a level of U.S. security and economic.
Andres, can I just jump in there? We just got about a minute left, but Congressman Don Bacon, a Republican, said, "My main concern is now Russia will use this to justify their illegal and barbaric military actions against Ukraine." Do you see that point?
I don't, and I think it's really disappointing that a congressman would look at this opportunity of relief for millions of Venezuelans who have suffered terrible authoritarian violence and repression for years, and point to some other conflict as if that's going to impact it. You know, the suffering of the Venezuelan people is no less significant and worthy of attention than the suffering of the Ukrainian people. But unfortunately, there are a lot of people in Congress who are more than willing to look away from Venezuela because I think because it's not politically convenient as a talking point.
Okay, Andres, thank you so much for that. Good to have your analysis on the program.
Thank you.
And let's just take you back to Stewart Air Force Base, where we see those pictures of that plane we believe U.S. media are reporting is carrying Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores. Of course, they were arrested, as President Trump said, in an operation in Caracas overnight into today. He will face an arraignment in the Southern District of New York, just about 60 miles from where that Air Force Base is located. We'll continue to keep our eye on those pictures and come back to you in just a few minutes. Stay with us here on BBC News.
Can we see more agents going onto the airplane now?
By the plane, what we believe are DEA and FBI agents. A few of them actually just went back on board the plane. And remember, this is just the first stop here in New York. Because from here, Nicolas Maduro and his wife are expected to be taken to New York City. That is where they face those charges of narco trafficking, cocaine importation, and possession of a machine gun. And so you'll see behind me, really, the whole world's media has gathered here to try to catch a glimpse of Nicolas Maduro as he is led off the plane. That first sight of him in public, because all we have seen so far is that image of him on the Iwo Jima ship, the U.S. Carrier ship, blindfolded, in handcuffs, in a tracksuit holding a bottle of water. And so now he has landed here on U.S. soil. I'm just looking down occasionally at the footage coming in, because from where we are, the plane is quite far back. But there are news copters that have been circling Sumi that are trained now on the plane to try to catch that first glimpse of Nicolas Maduro. And, you know, as I have said, this is just the first stop here in New York. He will go through the kind of immigration procedures here, but then eventually be taken down into law enforcement custody to be processed and booked on that 25-page indictment. He will be fingerprinted. He will have his mugshot taken. He will be held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, until he is later in court, we believe as early as Monday, to hear the charges formally against him, to be arraigned in court in front of a New York judge.
Tell us a bit more, Netta, as we're looking at these up-close pictures zoomed in on the door of the plane, awaiting whether that is, of course, the plane that President Maduro is on if he disembarks there with law enforcement, as you said. Tell us a bit more about that indictment that you were referring to and what exactly the charges are against President Maduro.
Yeah, well, look, after this stunning U.S. operation, the Attorney General Pam Bondi said that the U.S. had taken Nicolas Maduro and his wife and would be holding them to the full extent of the justice system in America on an indictment. And it was an indictment that built upon one from back in 2020, actually the first Trump administration, that accused Nicolas Maduro and other Venezuelan officials of narco trafficking, of working with the Colombia's FARC rebel group to import tons of cocaine into the United States. And so this indictment, this new indictment on Saturday today, really builds upon that with similar charges, but it adds his wife and his son onto that indictment, Sumi. And if you look at those charges, if Nicolas Maduro is convicted of all of the charges of importing cocaine, narco trafficking, possession of a machine gun, he could face between 30 years to life in prison if he is convicted unanimously by a jury. Now, the indictment itself, if you go through it, doesn't outline the specific evidence that the Department of Justice has to back up those charges. So it will be extremely interesting to see whether we will get further details of the evidence they have, what witnesses perhaps, what surveillance. There will certainly, given that this is a conspiracy that's alleged to have gone on for decades, there will be a lot of discovery for the lawyers to go through. So some of the key questions I'll be looking for, Sumi, is, who will be representing Nicolas Maduro and his wife? Will they have the same lawyer? Will they claim that he has immunity as a head of state? Will they argue that he should be off on bail? The experts I've spoken to say that that's all unlikely to be successful in a New York court. But we will see how this all plays out, because it could be up to a year before this trial takes place, if it indeed does.
Annetta, just as we are still waiting on that plane, we understand, of course, there is a big media presence there, but can you just give us a sense of, just what you are seeing in terms of, as we're trying to determine whether this is indeed the plane that we believe it is?
Yeah, well, look, Sumi, here outside the Stewart Air Base, this is a far quieter part of New York, unlike New York City. And what I can tell you, even before we got here, there were already a handful of protesters who had heard that this is where Nicolas Maduro would be landing. And they came with posters saying no war, no tyranny. They are unhappy with how the Trump administration has gone on with this military escalation and has essentially taken Nicolas Maduro outside of Venezuela here to face charges in New York, doubting that this is about, an attempt to hold him accountable for drug crimes and more about regime change and interest in Venezuela's oil reserves. So those protesters decided to come here to make their voices heard about their dissatisfaction with the U.S. government's moves here. But apart from that, it is a very quiet part of New York. And so it has been quite a sight to see the world's media all come down here. As you can see, the sun is going down now. It's getting quite late. But all day, there was a question of when Nicolas Maduro would land here, when that would happen, and how soon he would be taken to New York to be put in federal detention.
Okay, Netta, thank you so much. We'll let you go so you can do a bit more reporting there. We're continuing to keep an eye on that plane. And if you're just joining us, that is Stewart Air Force Base in New York. It's a bit dark. We can't see exactly what's happening at the door there, but we anticipate that might be the very plane carrying Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, his wife, Cilia Flores. Donald Trump, of course, announced earlier today that the U.S. launched strikes on Venezuela overnight and in a raid captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife at a fortress, a compound in Caracas. And he and his wife are at Stewart Air National Guard Base right now in New York State. That's what we understand. We have also heard today that President Trump says the U.S. is going to run Venezuela until there can be a safe and judicious transition. He was vague in the language of what that could mean. And since then, we've also heard that the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, we heard President Trump say that he understood she had been sworn in after President Maduro was arrested by U.S. military. And we heard from her a little bit earlier in the day saying President Maduro is the only president of Venezuela and that Venezuela will not be a colony of any other country. So it's unclear what the next steps are in Venezuela itself. But in the meantime, we are keeping an eye on that plane. Of course, President Maduro will be handed over to law enforcement officials, as we heard Neda say there, and he will then be taken to New York. He is facing charges of drug trafficking and terrorism, and he will be arraigned on those charges at some point this week. Let's bring in our State Department correspondent, Tom Bateman. Tom, we're keeping an eye on these pictures, awaiting our first view of President Maduro disembarking, perhaps. As we're waiting for some movement there, just bring us up to date on what you've been hearing on what the U.S.'s plans are.
Well, look, I mean, it's been many hours now since the explosions were echoing through the valley of Venezuela's capital, and in every hour that's passed, more and more detail about the nature of the operation itself, right from anonymous briefings from U.S. officials who claim that it was actually a CIA informant in Maduro's inner circle that was passing on information in real time about his location, right up to the moments of this raid, to the claims of swarms of stealth drones being used to track his location, to the briefing that he was then captured as he tried to escape through the steel door into a safe room when the Americans managed to capture him. All of that, I think, a sign of the imbalance of forces at play here and how, in effect, the Maduro regime didn't stand a chance against the US military operation that had been launched against it. But that leads you then to what happens next. And of course, Mr. Trump's press conference was key in trying to understand that. He didn't make any secret of the fact that he sees one of the major objectives here as access to Venezuela's oil resources. And I think that will concern many in the opposition in Venezuela who are going to see this is less about a democratic future for the country and more about a decapitation in which you potentially have the Americans now working with remnants of the Maduro regime if they try to keep them compliant. And also, you know, the criticisms from Democrats in Congress here have been saying, some of them, this is simply illegal and done without congressional authorization and risks destabilizing the region. So what happens next, I say, absolutely crucial. This is a gamble by President Trump, and it will be the coming hours and days in terms of what happens on the streets of Venezuela that I think will determine whether or not he can see this as a success.
Tom, we are seeing some movement on the stairs of that aircraft. It is quite dark, so it is difficult to tell who exactly is coming down the stairs. We are looking at these pictures at the moment. It looks to be agents, but again, quite difficult to tell without a bit more light on the entrance of the plane, that plane door there at Stewart Air Force Base. Tom, it was interesting to hear President Trump and also Marco Rubio talk in broader terms about the U.S.'s influence in the region as well, in the Western Hemisphere, clearly seeing this as part of a larger strategy.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think, first of all, it was interesting that Marco Rubio, I think, was the face of the administration that was trying to put this in very legal terms, to say that this was simply about enforcing an indictment that had been laid on Nicolas Maduro in the first Trump term for alleged drug trafficking allegations. He's always rejected, of course, seeing this as a front for regime change. But he was saying that, in his view, this was an operation led by the Department of Justice, or an initiative by the Department of Justice, was being supported by the United States military and the Pentagon. In terms of, as you say, the Western Hemisphere, this is, I think, another very dramatic signal of the way the administration sees the so-called Western Hemisphere, the Americas, as its number one national security priority. And in effect, what goes on in Latin America is now its number one national security threat in the form of drug and people smuggling. That was very clear from its national security strategy late last year. And they've seen Nicolas Maduro as a linchpin of that entire effort. And they have argued that removing somebody like him will help to alleviate that problem, in that they say, stability in America's own backyard. But of course, there will be many who say that this is, risking the very opposite of stability by carrying out an operation like this. But I think it shows you how the focus is now very firmly, as far as national security strategy for the US and for Mr. Trump on Latin America.
And Tom, can you tell us a bit more about the role of oil and U.S. oil interests in Venezuela, something we heard the president talk about pretty extensively in that press conference today?
Yeah, well, back in the day, many decades ago, many American oil companies were active in Venezuela. President Trump had said in the last few weeks that he believed that America had been denied a massive amount of the oil rights that it should have had in two periods of nationalization, or he alluded to that, but basically during the 70s and then when Hugo Chavez was in control in Venezuela. And it has been his contention that basically the Venezuelan government had stolen American oil rights through those periods of taking national control of its oil industry, and that therefore the US was owed. Now, we heard him, as I say, make absolutely no secret at all of the ambition here, which is to reclaim American control, as he would see it, of Venezuela's oil wealth. He said that there would be a huge amount of rebuilding of infrastructure that would be done and paid for by oil companies, and that money, he said, that wealth would be for the benefit of the people of Venezuela, but also, he said, for America, because it was owed. So there's no attempt to sort of conceal the idea here that oil is the objective, or one of the major objectives, even though, of course, to many of Mr. Maduro's opponents, this has been a moment for them to celebrate his removal. But it's interesting, I was talking to one resident in Caracas a bit earlier today, who is a supporter of the Venezuelan opposition, who said that they felt like this was a moment of justice in the removal of Maduro. But as soon as they heard from, or she heard from Donald Trump speaking at his press conference, she was very, very disappointed and found it almost laughable in the way he was then sort of couching this in terms of getting American wealth from its oil interests. And in a sense, as I say, a bit like a decapitation. But the risk is, I think, for the opposition, that they see this simply, in effect, as a coup by the remainder of the regime, replacing Nicolas Maduro with the Trump administration in terms of who now controls Venezuela. So, there is a huge risk here, as I say, a huge gamble. And I think how that plays out now within Venezuela will be absolutely critical in terms of the strategy that Mr. Trump has to try and pursue.
Okay, Tom Bateman, thank you very much for that reporting. We are still seeing some action there at Stewart Air Force Base. Some people moving up and down the stairs. It is, however, as you can see, very dark on that airfield. Not particularly easy at the moment to tell who is moving up and down the stairs. We understand, as U.S. media have reported, that this is the plane that is carrying President Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, to this Air Force Base, where they will then be transported to New York for arraignment this week. As we're watching these images, I want to bring in Congressman Joaquin Castro. He's a Democrat from Texas and serves as the ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. He's also a member in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman, thank you for joining us again on BBC News. What do you make of the dramatic events of the last day?
Well, this appears to be a war of regime change about oil and valuable natural resources and land, and really an aggressiveness by Donald Trump against Latin American countries that harkens back to the Monroe Doctrine and also harkens back to the Cold War era, where the United States unfortunately backed a lot of right-wing governments that committed horrible human rights abuses against their people. And we made a big mistake during those years to assume that every right-wing dictator was a friend of the United States, when in fact dictators can come from either side of the political spectrum. Nicolas Maduro was not a good guy. The election results were very suspicious in the last presidential election. But if that was how we determined who we were going to go take out around the world, you'd be taking out a lot of leaders around the world. And yet Donald Trump has praised Vladimir Putin. He's praised MBS in Saudi Arabia. He's never confronted China on their treatment of the Uyghurs. And so there's a lot of, unfortunately, hypocrisy here and irony as well.
Congressman, President Trump, the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, they have been clear this is a very different situation because President Maduro presented a direct threat to the United States in being the head of what they called an illegal drug trafficking operation. And they have said many times poisoning thousands of Americans, killing thousands of Americans. What do you make of that justification for this operation?
A few things. First, Americans by and large stand against these dangerous, poisonous drugs that have killed and harmed so many Americans. But I think it's important to realize a few things. Number one, Venezuela doesn't traffic in fentanyl, which over the last many years has been the drug most responsible for the deadly overdoses of Americans. Secondly, if you look at where these boats were going, many of them were not headed to the United States. They were headed, well, we don't know for sure because the government, the United States government, my government never said who was on those boats, exactly what they were carrying, presented any evidence, but we'll assume that they were carrying drugs. Those drugs were very likely going to Europe, not to the United States. And then it would be a lot easier to believe that this was about containing drugs, stopping drugs, if President Trump had not, in fact, pardoned one of the largest drug traffickers the United States and the world has ever known, the former president of Honduras, and doing so in a very, very bold and irresponsible way. And so I think most Americans don't believe that this is about drugs when you pardon a large drug dealer and when the facts on the ground speak differently than what the president is saying.
Congressman, the Secretary of State talked a bit earlier about why Congress was not notified. And he said this is not the type of mission you could notify members of Congress on. At the core, this was about two indicted fugitives of American justice. And he said you can't pre-notify because it endangers the mission. And President Trump then followed on to say Congress has a tendency to leak. What's your response to that?
Well, I think that's wrong. And it directly contradicts what he told me and the rest of the House of Representatives in a briefing that the administration did the last week that we were in session in December, where I directly asked him whether he would come to Congress seeking an authorization for use of military force. And his answer was that we will go to Congress for anything that requires an AUMF. And so I would say that taking out the leader of a sovereign country, bombing it to do that, and then going in there onto the ground of that country to accomplish the mission, that's something that you need congressional approval for, and certainly notification before it happens and not after it happens. So the administration has failed to include Congress in this decision. And the American people don't elect 535 members of Congress to be on the sidelines of big decisions like this.
What about what happens next? President Trump says the U.S. will run Venezuela. What do you think that means, and what are your concerns there?
I mean, that is deeply concerning on a few fronts. Number one, as a world, not just as a nation, but as a world, we tried to get away from that, where one country would directly, from Washington, D.C. or another capital, control what's going on in a sovereign nation. And Donald Trump is taking us back decades, if not generations. And then also, when you think about how much it's going to cost the United States of America and our taxpayers, the American people, this is not a $500 endeavor. This is billions and billions and billions of dollars that we're talking about. It's as if the American president never learned the lessons of Iraq or Afghanistan. And really, the people that stand to benefit the most, if not the only ones who will benefit, I believe, are his political cronies, who will figure out a way to divvy up the different natural resources and industries in Venezuela and make money for themselves. And in the meantime, for Americans, they're losing their health care coverage right now because President Trump and the Republicans didn't extend health care subsidies. Child care prices are going up. Grocery prices are going up. All kinds of prices in the United States are going up. And we're about to spend billions of dollars running Venezuela from Washington, D.C.
President Trump has said removing President Maduro makes the entire Western Hemisphere safer. And our reporter who's been speaking to the diaspora, Venezuelan diaspora in Miami, they are celebrating the removal of President Maduro, saying he is a dictator who has suppressed his own people for years and years, and that this was the right move. Is there an argument to be made that this indeed was a pinpoint operation to remove someone who's considered a dictator, not just by the U.S., but by many countries, and that this will help Venezuela moving forward?
Yeah, I think a few conflicting things, or things that feel like they're conflicting. First, I'm not surprised at all that many Venezuelans are celebrating because Nicolas Maduro was not a good guy to his people. He did abuse his people. He very likely lost the election to Mr. Gonzalez in the last presidential election. But at the same time, that just doesn't justify Donald Trump under false pretenses and for the reasons of acquisition of oil and resources and land to go take out a sovereign president and put in his own person as the head of that country and to temporarily at least run the country from Washington, D.C.
What do you expect to hear from the administration in Congress this week? It appears that the actual military operation, of course, was completed. Are you going to seek an authorization for any further military action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was part of the resolution that Jim McGovern had that we lost by 2 votes. This would have prevented this action. It was a bipartisan resolution with Representative Massey of Kentucky. We lost that vote by 2 votes. We're going to refile that this week. Ilhan Omar and others also have another resolution, a similar resolution. So there will be further votes on this. And this should be an easy one for members of Congress. Now that there was a land strike, now that the United States and the president has said that the United States government is running Venezuela, and it seems like we'll have some occupation of Caracas there in some form or fashion, then the Congress should be willing to say, hey, we're going to step up and have a role in deciding what this looks like or whether we're even going to permit it.
Congressman, really good to get your perspective. Thank you so much for joining us today on BBC News.
Good to be with you.
And we're just seeing some people disembarking the plane at the moment. You can see just really their silhouettes. It's too dark to make out who is coming down those stairs. We understand from U.S. media reports that this is the plane carrying President Nicolas Maduro, his wife Celia Flores. They're being charged with drug trafficking and terrorism offenses, expected to be arraigned in New York this week. We are keeping an eye on those stairs to see if we can make out exactly who is departing at the moment, who is getting off down those stairs, and whether we can get a glimpse there of President Maduro himself. The only picture we, of course, have seen is the one that President Trump had posted on Truth Social earlier in the day as Nicolas Maduro was being transported on the Iwo Jima ship as he was being transported to the U.S. after he was arrested in Caracas by the U.S. Delta Force, a special force that took part in the extraction of Mr. Maduro. We see a few people walking down the stairs. Again, hard to tell whether this is Mr. Maduro or not. We're going to continue to keep our eye on that until we have confirmation that indeed perhaps is Mr. Maduro. You see a larger group of people perhaps accompanying someone. So that could be the Venezuelan president. It could be also the Venezuelan president's wife, the First Lady, Celia Flores. But again, without more light, simply very, very difficult to tell. We understand, of course, that Mr. Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, they were arrested at their compound that was a heavily guarded fortress in Caracas. And this was actually a Delta Special Force mission that took place in the middle of the night. So we understand from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, in the press conference earlier, he said that the extraction unit, part of the Delta Force, that they arrived there at that compound around 1 a.m. And they were able to leave with Mr. Maduro and Celia Flores around 3 a.m. So just about a little over 2 hours that entire mission took, that there were helicopters that got cover from Air Force jets that were protecting that mission, and that those helicopters did receive some fire from the Venezuelan forces, we presume, who were defending President Maduro. It looks like, from the way the cameras are moving at the moment, that we might have just seen Mr. Maduro disembark from that plane. Of course, we cannot get a glimpse of him ourselves, but we understand that he'll be taken to custody by law enforcement officials for that arraignment in New York. Hoping to get a bit of a better picture for you that we can focus in on. As we're trying to get a better picture, let's bring in a former CIA hacker and cybersecurity expert, Eric Cole, who's joining me. Eric, thanks for your patience. We're just trying to get a better picture of what exactly is taking place on the ground. But as we are doing so, if you can give us a sense of what you make of the lead up to the extraction. We understand that a CIA agent actually within the Venezuelan government had been informing the U.S. military on his location, his whereabouts, everything from what he ate to his pets.
This was a planned operation that typically takes multiple months. And what people need to recognize is there's not a set date or time. You have to wait for a window of opportunity. So there's a very good chance that this was planning to happen later in January, and that the president maybe was going to tell Congress. But what often happens is, based on unpredicted movements of the targets, they got a call yesterday saying we have a window of opportunity that increases success, decreases loss of life. And you typically have minutes to make that decision. And to me, when you have these opportunities, you have to take them, and you can't pause or hesitate. So I know there's a lot of criticism, but as a president, when you're relying on expertise and you have a window to extract somebody, and in this case, there were very low, if any, casualties, this was a very successful mission and needed to be operated on very quickly.
What would have gone into the planning in terms of the surveillance of Mr. Maduro, his inner circle, in being able to carry out such a mission?
Typically, you would go in and spend years monitoring and tracking his behavior. The nice thing now is, with artificial intelligence, you can do predictive analysis a lot quicker and a lot faster. So most likely what they did is they were able to take all of his activity and behaviors over multiple years, feed it into AI engines and say, okay, if we want to capture the president and his wife, we put in a scenario with 0 casualties and minimal risk. When is the best time, location, and other factors? And for many reasons, there could have been last night, maybe there was a shift in the guards. Maybe there were some guards that weren't normal on duty, that were less experienced. There's all these factors that people don't realize were taken into account. This just wasn't a random decision. They were looking at experience, who was guarding, what the feedback, what the retaliation was, and all those factors are typically fed into AI models to come up with responses of when is the best time with minimal casualties to strike.
We understand that the weather actually played a part as well, that this was a factor. What do you make of that?
Everything comes into play. If you go in, and anything that can go in and make it harder for the opposing forces to see you or hear you can be a net positive. For example, we often look at things like rain and fog, but all of those things have impact both on our weapons and the weapons of the opposing forces. Also, if there's bad weather, they might not be typically where they are, which could give us a greater opportunity. So yeah, all these factors come into play. Temperature, because once again, when you're looking at a lot of these different things, colder temperatures can have negative impacts on weapons. Higher temperatures could also. So all these things have to come into play of saying, what is the best chance of our forces operating at peak performance and the other side having a disadvantage so we can acquire the target with minimal losses?
What would the operation look like going forward? I mean, President Trump has said that the U.S. will be running Venezuela, but clearly there is a vacuum now with the president gone, and it's not entirely clear what the U.S. involvement will look like and whether the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, whether she will work with the U.S. as President Trump has claimed. So what could, continued military operations or even intelligence operations look like?
Yeah, that's my biggest concern right now is the president was captured many hours ago, and there's still not an official person leading the country, that's where things can get very dangerous very quickly. This is where I'm very concerned, is typically with an operation like this, you would have the planned successor in place and ready to take control very quickly after. And once again, this is sort of unprecedented. But if you go back to probably the closest scenario when we did this in Iraq, where they went in, they already had somebody who was planned to succeed the president at the time and took over within hours. So yeah, this is something that the administration is going to have to get in front of very, very quickly. And somebody is going to need to stand up and say, I am running this country. Otherwise, things can go to chaos very quickly. And you also have to remember, Venezuela was poorly run. Last year, their infrastructure, their electricity, their water went down many, many times. I mean, this is a country in ruins, and hours where people retaliate and don't know what's going on could actually make things a lot worse, not a lot better. So somebody needs to take control, and the United States needs to back them within hours, not days.
Okay, Eric, thank you for that insight. Good to have you on with us today. Eric Cole, a cybersecurity expert. If you're just joining us, we're looking at some live pictures of the Stewart Air Force Base there in New York State. We believe that the Venezuelan president has disembarked the airplane that he arrived on just about half an hour ago, we believe, alongside Cilia Flores, the First Lady of Venezuela. We believe that he is now going to be transported to New York, where he'll be held in a facility ahead of an arraignment in New York this week. In the Southern District of New York, he's facing charges of drug trafficking and of terrorism. Now, we haven't ourselves been able to see President Maduro. It was simply too dark on the airstrip there where the plane had landed and where everyone was disembarking from the plane. A large group of agents, or could be military as well, leading President Maduro there. So we haven't been able to verify seeing him ourselves, but we understand U.S. media reporting that he did indeed arrive. And let's go to Neda Taufik, who is there at the base. She's been covering the entire arrival for us. Neda, what more can you tell us?
Yeah, well, Sumi, I mean, as you can see behind me, it's absolutely dark here now, but the plane did land a ways back in the airbase here. And there were actually news copters circling above, trying to get those images to capture those moments when Nicolas Maduro would appear in public for the first time since we saw that image of him on the ship, the Iwo Jima, in handcuffs, a blindfold, and a tracksuit. But as you mentioned there, we were all, glued to those images, but it was simply too dark to see much. We know that there are numerous DEA, FBI agents there on that aircraft, and that now the second part of his journey in New York begins, from taking him here at the Stewart Air Base, about 60 miles north of Manhattan, by helicopter to Manhattan itself, to begin that process of being booked as any other criminal defendant of high profile would be, to be fingerprinted, to have his mugshot taken along with his wife, Cilia Flores. And from there, they will go to the Brooklyn Metropolitan Detention Center. And look, I've spoken to numerous former prosecutors, defense lawyers, Sumi, who do believe that they will be held in special housing away from the general population just for their safety. And it will be some time, we believe Monday, before they will then have the charges against them formally read out in court. That 25-page indictment, of course, accusing Nicolas Maduro of narco-terrorism, of importing tons of cocaine into the United States, of possession of a machine gun. All of that, the Department of Justice accusing him of using the power of government and working with corrupt officials to enrich themselves and to work with drug cartels, which the U.S. has now designated as terror organizations, to then use cocaine as a weapon in the United States. And what's been really interesting is to see how Marco Rubio, the Secretary Secretary of State, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, have all suggested that he isn't a legitimate president. And so in that sense, they were in their legal right to go and capture him within Venezuela, just as they said they would any fugitive on the run from the United States. That coming despite others here in the U.S., Republicans, Democrats, legal experts, questioning the legality of them taking Nicolas Maduro and this military escalation. So, Sumi, the indictment hasn't gone into really detailed accounting of the evidence they have against Nicolas Maduro. That will come. We shall see. That will be a long process of exchanging evidence with his ultimate defense attorneys. And that is also a question. Who will be appointed? Who will he get himself, Nicolas Maduro, to represent him in court? And how will all of this play out when a trial could take a year or more before getting underway?
That's a really important point, Netta, that you make there. On the timing of this, what do we usually see in terms of an arraignment and how quickly this process moves? Obviously, each case is different, but do we have any sense of a timetable of when this arraignment might happen in the Southern District of New York this week?
Yeah, what we have been expecting is that it could be Monday morning, and that certainly fits the timeline of, again, the federal prosecutors and defense lawyers who I've spoken to. They believe it would happen as soon as Monday morning, but it will be an extremely short court appearance, Sumi. Again, he will just formally be read the charges against him. He will be allowed to have a defense attorney appointed for him if he's unable to get his own. But then we really are into just understanding how the judge will schedule the next few hearings ahead of an eventual trial. Sorry, as you can see, there are cars coming and going along this road, so a bit loud. But we really are then following a standard court procedure. There is going to be so much discovery evidence that has to be exchanged between the two sides. No doubt that Nicolas Maduro's lawyers are going to be eager to get their hands on that. It'll be interesting to see whether they argue for bail on Monday at the arraignment, because everyone I've spoken to said that they don't believe there's any chance at all that Nicolas Maduro and his wife will get bail, and so they wonder if their representatives will even argue for that. But it will be the first step, of course, Monday, in what will be a long discussion between the two sides about how soon this trial can get underway.
Okay, Netta Tawfik at the Stewart Air Force Base. We understand President Maduro did disembark that plane. We see a group of people there, obviously in the darkness. Very difficult to tell where Mr. Maduro is among that group of people, if he indeed is being led there along with his wife, Cilia Flores, both arrested in Caracas. We'll continue to keep an eye on those images, and Netta will keep us updated, of course, from the Air Force Base. But in the meantime, I want to head to my colleague, Daniel Pardo. He's from BBC Mundo, and he's in Cucuta, that is on the Colombian border with Venezuela. And Daniel, thank you for joining us. Just so you know, we're going to keep our eye on this Air Force Base that we're watching. But what have you seen there at the border? Has there been quite a bit of movement back and forth between Venezuela and Colombia today?
Look, there is no other country that is as affected as Colombia from what happens in Venezuela. 1/3 of the Venezuelans who have fled the country in the past decade because of the political and economic crisis are in Colombia. And that's part of the reason why we've seen all day Colombian authorities coming to the border from the government, from the military. They are gathering here to see what happens. But also, on the other hand, you have the fact that President Gustavo Petro has rejected Mr. Trump's intervention and has said that this is a violation of international law. So there's a fear that this intervention could lead to something else here in Colombia. Trump himself has said that Petro should look after himself after this.
Indeed. Can you tell us a bit more about that military buildup that Gustavo Petro has announced? That would indicate that they are concerned there could be U.S. military action in Colombia as well?
Because the reason why Trump made this intervention in Venezuela, which is the alleged drug dealing of Mr. Maduro, you can also apply it in a way to Colombia, in the sense that Colombia is one of the largest producers of cocaine in the world. And according to Mr. Trump, Petro is part of that equation. The other thing is that Colombia is one of the sources of most of the conflictivity that you see in Venezuela. There are military, guerrilla, paramilitary, and drug dealing groups that are along the side of the other border. And that shows the reason why this is kind of a story that happens in both countries. So that's why Trump is dealing with both presidents at the same time. And that's why this huge concern here in Colombia, because it's a major story basically for them. They've been seeing them, Venezuelans coming year after year, creating a life here in Colombia. So of course, this is major news for Colombia as well.
Indeed, Daniel, as you are there at the border, how does the Colombian government and Gustavo Petro see Nicolás Maduro? He is considered an illegitimate leader by the U.S., by European countries, that he had lost the previous election. What has his relationship been with Nicolás Maduro?
This border was closed during the previous government in Colombia of Iván Duque. Part of the reason why it was closed, it was because Iván Duque didn't accept Nicolás Maduro as president. Then came leftist Gustavo Petro, a former guerrilla member, who came with another approach. He dealt with Maduro, he opened back the border, and has been trying to use him as leverage because there are huge presence of guerrilla groups at the other side of the border in Venezuela. And part of the reason why is that Maduro would be someone who would help Colombia to get peace deals with these groups. So Petro has been trying to show himself as someone who is not really close to Maduro, but someone who is able to deal with him and who's able to sort some sort of transition in this government. But he wasn't able to do it because all dialogue interventions and all the dialogue initiatives weren't successful. And that's why Petro is not in a good place in that sense. But now he's trying to show himself as someone tough and someone who can at least face Trump in terms of military here in the region.
And Daniel, I do want to ask you, interesting that the Department of Justice's indictment also included two Colombian groups in its in the description of what they're accusing Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro of, includes the FARC and the ELN, the ELN, both guerrilla groups. What role do they have in Venezuela? What do we know about that?
They have a huge role in what happens in Venezuela. During the past 10 years, at least, these groups have migrated into Venezuela. Some say that they have some sort of alliance with the Venezuelan government. That is what emerged with the idea of the Cartel de los Soles, the Sun Cartel. That's part of the reason why Trump intervened in Venezuela, because what happens in Colombia kind of happens also in Venezuela, and these groups have consolidated themselves as binational groups. That's part of the reason why whatever happens in Venezuela will show its first consequences here in the border, where millions of people cross every day, live here, have day-to-day things to do in both sides of the country and both sides of the border. There's people who go to study in one side and go to buy stuff in the other. So the consequences here are going to be big. And that's part of the reason why there's such calmness here. This is a very active place in the world, one of the most active places I've seen. But to see it like this, as quiet as this, it shows that people are looking to what happens. No, they are concerned of what comes next.
Okay, Daniel Pardo, my colleague from BBC Mundo, great to speak to you. Thank you very much for that update from Colombia. We're continuing to keep our eye on those pictures that you see. They're now a very dark Stewart Air Force Base in the state of New York. We understand that President Maduro did arrive about half an hour to an hour ago, and that he disembarked from the plane that was carrying him, and that he has been transferred to law enforcement authorities here in the U.S. as he will be facing those charges and an arraignment in New York City this week. This after the dramatic events of the U.S. leading an overnight raid inside Venezuela in Caracas to arrest and extradite the Venezuelan president and his wife, the First Lady, Cilia Flores. We're going to bring you a report now from inside Venezuela. The BBC's Vanessa Silva is in the capital, Caracas, and she watched the American attack unfold.
Handcuffed, blindfolded, capture from his country. This is Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro being sent to the U.S. after being seized by U.S. forces. Pictures posted by President Trump on social media appear to show him and his top officials watching the overnight operations unfold.
It was a force against a heavily fortified military fortress in the heart of Caracas to bring outlaw dictator Nicolas Maduro to justice. It was dark and it was deadly, but captured along with his wife, Cilia Flores, both of whom now face American justice.
The capture led many wondering who will now run Venezuela. And then this.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
Nicolas Maduro has led Venezuela for more than a decade. Now, Washington says he will face charges including terrorism and drug trafficking in the United States. His capture was part of a huge military operation, with Venezuelans ripped from their sleep by loud explosions in military sites across the country. Residents cowered in fear as the U.S. military struck an airstrip and a military base in the heart of the capital, Caracas. For months, Washington has sent troops, warships, and aircraft to the Caribbean. It has seized oil tankers near Venezuela and carried out dozens of strikes on alleged drug boats, killing at least 110 people. The U.S. has long accused Nicolas Maduro of running a criminal network, claims he denies. Just days ago, he said he was open to talks.
If they want to seriously discuss an agreement to combat drug trafficking, we're ready. If they want Venezuelan oil, is Venezuela ready for U.S. investments? Like with Chevron, whenever, wherever, and however they want.
Venezuelans have been living under the threat of U.S. military action for weeks. The U.S. has now acted on that threat, and most Venezuelans, supporters and opponents of President Nicolas Maduro, are simply concerned about what comes next.
Look, you see the streets empty. People are in their own thing, buying things to go back home. A lot of uncertainty in the entire country for everyone. You, me, someone walking. What will happen tomorrow? What will happen in the next hour? Nobody knows, but, well, it's an enigma that we are living right now.
Many Venezuelans wanted Nicolas Maduro out. He was widely considered to have stolen the recent presidential election. But as the hours pass, the full realization of what has happened is hitting Venezuelans. Despite these historic events, the future remains as uncertain as ever. Vanessa Silva, BBC News, Caracas.
Now, for several years, Juan Guaidó led the Venezuelan opposition's push to remove Maduro from power and hold new elections. Back in 2018, much of the international community, including the U.S. and dozens of European and Latin American governments, recognized him as the legitimate leader of Venezuela. But the opposition under Guaidó failed to get the military or courts on its side, and Maduro's regime further tightened its grip on Venezuela. His parallel government was dissolved in 2023. I spoke to him earlier for his thoughts on today's events. Juan, thank you so much for joining us. First, I just want to get your reaction on the U.S. operation to arrest Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
Today, Venezuela is a country that wakes up without the dictator, without the person who stole the elections, and with the expectation of achieving justice. This justice was denied not only to Venezuelans, to the victims of torture or repression, and to those who were victims of the theft of their vote more than a year ago. So, the end of the impunity with which Maduro, Díaz-Canel, Ortega or Putin act is good news, not just for Venezuelans, but also for democracy worldwide.
Sino también para la democracia en todo el mundo.
But, Juan, do you believe that it was legal for the U.S. to act on Venezuelan territory to arrest Mr. Maduro?
Mira, Maduro es un delincuente.
He's a criminal with an arrest warrant and a bounty, not just for terrorism and drug trafficking. He stole an election. For a long time, impunity has reigned in Venezuela and in Latin America. They use terrorist groups to threaten people. He's under investigation by the International Criminal Court. Rather, the question should be, why was action not taken sooner? Why wasn't the Inter-American Human Rights Charter been more effective in protecting the most vulnerable in Venezuela and the 8 million migrants and refugees? So, for us, it is very good news that impunity is ending and that a criminal like Maduro is being brought to justice.
So let me ask you this then, Juan. We heard the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say that he had spoken to the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, that they would work together. And at the same time, she has said that Venezuela will not be a colony of anyone. Do you believe that she will work with the United States?
Mira, yo escuché al presidente Trump siendo muy enfático en la lista de demandas.
Look, I heard President Trump being very emphatic about the list of demands made to the Maduro regime and the need to restore the constitutional order in Venezuela, which relates to July 28th and to democracy. So I stand precisely by that list of demands referenced by President Trump regarding what it meant to take Maduro away without more victims. I mean, more victims beyond those the Maduro dictatorship has already claimed. So in a transition and the recovery of democracy, Delcy Rodriguez is nothing more than, we hope, a very short phase.
Una transición y en la recuperación de la democracia, Delcy Rodríguez no solamente es más que una, esperemos, muy corta etapa.
Who should be leading that transition? We heard President Trump, he was asked about Maria Corina Machado and her role, and he said he doesn't think she has the respect to lead the country. The Venezuelan opposition has been working, of course, to try to lead Venezuela. So what do you think the role of the opposition should be?
Mire, María Corina hace unos días decía que sabía.
Look, Maria Corina Machado said a few days ago that she knew the transition in Venezuela is complex. It was in 1958, during the fall of the dictator Pérez Jiménez, who led the transition. In Chile, when Pinochet remained Minister of Defense several additional years, it was a complex transition. But the majority of the Venezuelan people spoke very clearly and expressed themselves in the 2024 elections. There is a possibility that this will be a rapid transition to a full democracy where institutions reign and not simply the way of force that Maduro and part of that regime try to impose.
Donde no simplemente la vía de la fuerza que ha tratado de imponer Maduro y ahora parte de ese régimen.
So Juan, can I just ask you, can I jump in there? It is complex, of course, but do you think that Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo González should be put in place immediately?
Maria Corina Machado is currently forced into exile, as is Edmundo González Urrutia. The first challenge is precisely the return to Venezuela safely. And we believe this is the first opportunity we Venezuelans will have in the coming days or weeks.
President Trump talked about Venezuela's oil reserves, and he said that U.S. companies would be going in to extract those reserves. Are you concerned that the U.S. will be profiting from Venezuela's oil wealth without the country also profiting?
Para los venezolanos, lo importante es la industria petrolera.
For Venezuelans, the important thing about the oil industry is that it is the lever for development and growth. Unfortunately, under Chavez and Maduro, it has also been a source of persecution, a way to profit from the tragedy of Venezuelans and used as a geopolitical weapon, not only to negotiate with Iran, China, Russia, and Cuba, as is the case of the so-called Petrocaribe, which they continue to do today, for Venezuelans to be able to return to the community of nations and develop their oil industry again. One essential thing is needed: legal certainty and personal safety, which are only possible by recovering democracy. The natural market for Venezuelans is the United States market, not just because of distance, but because of the type of crude processing. That is why it is very important to recover the oil industry. From the Venezuelan perspective, oil is a lever for development and growth, but also a possibility for geopolitical stabilization, not only hemispherically, but globally. Russia is a bad partner for Venezuelans, not just due to natural competition and distance, but because of how they try to weaponize both the chaos and the energy assets in the region.
Juan, just really quickly, in 30 seconds or so, are you confident that Venezuelans will be part of this transition?
Look, we Venezuelans are confident that we are going to be part of a transition to democracy. That is the most important thing right now. Seeing Maduro handcuffed and brought to justice is a sign of justice and the end of impunity. It is also a great challenge in terms of recovering our country's democracy, the return of millions of exiles, and the possibility for many who found a door to exile to walk the streets of Venezuela again.
Muchísimos que nos encontramos forzados al exilio.
We're looking at some pictures from New York City, from downtown New York. This is the West 30th Street heliport. So this is a location that receives helicopters, and we understand that shortly we are going to see President Nicolás Maduro, the Venezuelan president, his wife, Cilia Flores, the first lady, arriving here. We just a short while ago saw a plane carrying the two arriving at the Stewart Air Force Base. That's about 60 miles from Manhattan, as President Maduro was brought into the country. Again, the first lady as well. We understand that he's been transferred to U.S. law enforcement officials and will be arriving at this helicopter port in Manhattan shortly. That is because he has been charged by the U.S. government, the Department of Justice, with drug trafficking and terrorism charges. He is expected to face an arraignment this week in the Southern District of New York. That's the jurisdiction there in New York City, where he will be facing these charges, expected to appear in court. That arraignment could happen as early as Monday, we understand, according to some legal experts the BBC has been speaking to. It could also happen a bit later in the week. All of this after this dramatic day of events. As we know, U.S. forces, a special force, arresting President Maduro and his wife in a compound in Caracas, then leaving Caracas and Venezuela, bringing them to the U.S., and President Trump said it was a massive success. So that is the news at this hour. We'll bring you an update on the headlines at the top of the next hour. Stay with us.